Welcome to Quiet Chronicles, the place for long, unhurried history, built for the quiet hours when your mind needs somewhere calm to drift. Wherever you're listening from tonight, in bed, on a late drive, half asleep already, it's good to have you here. The story of Nero usually gets told backward, as the ending first, the monster, the man who fiddled while his city burned. But his final words, as Rome's histories remember them, were not about power or fire or blood. He said the world was losing a great artist, not an emperor, an artist. That single sentence holds the whole contradiction of his life. A man who inherited the most feared throne on earth and spent it chasing applause instead, and in the end lost both the empire and the audience in the same breath. If you'd like more nights like this one, subscribing helps more than you'd think, and sharing this with someone who loves history the way you do keeps these stories going. For those who want to support the work further, there's a Patreon link waiting in the description. Tonight moves through one life, from a dangerous birth into a dangerous family, toward a fall that reshaped Rome itself. Let the lamps dim and let Rome begin. Chapter 1: Blood and Ambition. The Domitia Henobarbi were not new money in Rome, and they never let anyone forget it. Their name meant bronze beard, a nod to a legend where twin gods were said to have touched one ancestor's face and turned his beard the color of copper overnight. Whether or not anyone still believed that story by the 1st century, the family kept it alive anyway because it suited them. They had produced consuls, generals, men who fought alongside Julius Caesar, and men who fought against him. Pride ran in that bloodline like a second inheritance, often outweighing caution. By the time Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus came of age, the family had married its way into the innermost circle of imperial Rome. He was said to be arrogant even by the standards of his own house, a man who reportedly once ran down a child on the Appian Way with his chariot and felt no need to apologize for it. Cruelty toward inferiors was not unusual among Roman aristocrats. What set Domitius apart was the sense, even among his peers, that he enjoyed it a little too openly. Still, his blood was exactly what the imperial family needed for its own purposes. His marriage to Agrippina the Younger was not a romance. It was a calculation, stitching the Domitia line directly into the house of Augustus through Agrippina's descent from the first emperor's own blood. Agrippina herself came from formidable stock. Her mother, the elder Agrippina, had been a symbol of old Roman virtue hounded to death by the paranoia of Tiberius's court. Her father, Germanicus, had been beloved by the legions and possibly murdered for it. She grew up inside a family where affection and assassination lived in the same house. Their son was born on the 15th of December in the year 37 in the coastal town of Antium, south of Rome. Ancient writers later claimed the sunrise that morning never fully broke through cloud, as though the sky itself hesitated. That detail almost certainly belongs to legend rather than fact, the kind of embellishment history attaches to men once their story has already turned dark. At the time, though, there was nothing ominous about it at all. A son had been born to a well-connected, wealthy Roman family, and for the moment, That was the whole of the news. His father did not receive the news warmly. When friends offered congratulations, Domitius is said to have replied that nothing good could come from him and Agrippina, given who they both were. It is one of those quotes that historians repeat because it fits so neatly with what came later, and for that very reason it deserves some suspicion. True or invented, it captures something real about the household the boy was born into. Ambition and unease sat side by side in that family from the very beginning. The child was named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, carrying his father's name forward as Roman sons were expected to. Nothing in that name suggested he would ever wear a crown. Rome in 37 was ruled by Tiberius, an aging, withdrawn emperor spending his final years on the island of Capri, increasingly detached from the city he governed. Succession was already a live question, and eyes across the aristocracy were fixed on Tiberius's likely heir. That heir was Agrippina's own brother, a young man the legions had nicknamed Caligula, Little Boots, after the miniature soldier's sandals he wore as a child among his father's troops. Tiberius died that same year, and Caligula rose to the throne to public celebration. Rome had grown weary of an old emperor ruling in absence through fear and informers. His replacement was young, handsome, and the son of the beloved Germanicus, and crowds greeted him as though a golden age had finally arrived. For Agrippina, her brother's accession was a personal triumph as much as a political one. Her family had suffered under Tiberius, and now a Julio-Claudian of her own generation held supreme power. The early months of Caligula's reign did nothing to dispel the optimism. He recalled exiled relatives, paid promised bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and staged lavish public games that Romans had missed under Tiberius's austerity. Agrippina and her sisters were given honors unusual for imperial women, their names inscribed on coins, their images placed in public alongside the emperor's own. For a brief window, the family of Germanicus stood at the very center of Roman public life. Infant Lucius was, by extension, a child of extraordinary proximity to power. That proximity would not remain comfortable for long. Within a year or two, reports began circulating of a serious illness that had struck Caligula, one from which he seemed to recover physically, but not, by most accounts, in temperament. The change described by contemporaries was abrupt and unsettling. A ruler who had opened his reign with generosity began showing signs of paranoia, cruelty, and an appetite for humiliation that alarmed even those closest to him. Whether illness caused this shift or merely revealed something that had been present all along remains one of the unresolved questions of the period. Agrippina's position, once so secure, grew steadily more dangerous as her brother's suspicion widened to include his own family. Caligula had never trusted easily, and imperial history had taught every Roman that blood relation offered no protection against an emperor's fear. Agrippina and her sister Livilla found themselves implicated, rightly or not, in a conspiracy against their brother involving a prominent senator named Lepidus. The charges may have been exaggerated or entirely fabricated to remove women whose popularity rivaled the emperor's own. Regardless of the truth behind them, the consequences were real and immediate. In the year 39, Agrippina was stripped of her honors and exiled to the Pontine Islands, a scattering of small, harsh outposts off the Italian coast used for centuries to isolate Rome's disgraced elite. She was barely into her 20s, already a widow in practical terms given her husband's failing health, and now separated from her infant son entirely. Roman law and custom gave fathers full authority over children in such situations, but Domitius himself did not live to exercise it for long. He died not long after her exile, leaving Lucius an orphan of circumstance, if not literally of both parents. Custody of the young boy passed to his aunt, Domitia Lepida, a woman with her own tangled ambitions and connections throughout Roman high society. Some ancient accounts claim she treated her nephew with real affection, even indulgence, providing the stability his own parents had failed to offer. Other accounts suggest her care was calculated, a long-term investment in a boy who, however unlikely it seemed at the time, still carried imperial blood in his veins. Either way, those early years shaped him in ways later observers would strain to explain. A child raised amid exile, disgrace, and shifting guardianship rarely emerges from it unmarked. Meanwhile, in Rome, Caligula's reign continued its descent into the erratic and the cruel. Stories spread of extravagant spending that emptied the treasury within a few short years, of humiliations inflicted on senators for sport, of a ruler increasingly convinced of his own divinity. Some of these stories were almost certainly exaggerated by later historians eager to draw a stark contrast with what followed. But even accounting for exaggeration, a pattern of instability at the very top of Roman government was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The empire's foundation had grown unsteady, and everyone with a stake in power understood the danger that instability created. For a boy in exile from the court, none of this instability offered any comfort. Lucius grew up hearing, at best, second-hand reports of an uncle he could not remember clearly and a mother he had barely known. Roman aristocratic childhood was rarely warm even under the best circumstances, built more around duty and education than affection. For Lucius, those circumstances were harsher still, shaped by absence rather than presence. Whatever affection Domitia Lepida did offer him became, in a real sense, the closest thing to a stable childhood he had. The turning point came in the year 41, when a conspiracy among Praetorian officers and senators finally succeeded where earlier plots had failed. Caligula was murdered inside the imperial palace itself, cut down by men sworn to protect him, in an assassination that shocked the city even as many quietly welcomed it. The Senate briefly entertained the idea of restoring the old republic, debating through a chaotic night while armed guards controlled the palace grounds. That idea died quickly under the practical reality of Praetorian power. By morning, Caligula's uncle Claudius, a man widely dismissed by his own family as unfit to rule, had been proclaimed emperor by the very soldiers who had just killed his predecessor. Claudius's rise changed the political landscape for everyone connected to the imperial family, Agrippina included. He was, after all, her uncle as well as Caligula's, and family ties in Rome carried both danger and opportunity depending on how they were played. One of his early acts as emperor was recalling the exiles Caligula had banished, a gesture meant to signal a break from his predecessor's cruelty. Among those recalled was Agrippina, returned at last from the Pontine Islands to a Rome transformed by two changes of ruler in the span of her exile. Her son, meanwhile, was approaching 4 years old, a child who had already outlived one uncle's paranoia and witnessed, however distantly, the death of another emperor by violence. Nothing about Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in the year 41 marked him as a future ruler of Rome. He was simply a young boy, recently reunited with a mother scarred by exile and loss, living in a city where imperial power had just proven itself both absolute and lethal in the same generation. Claudius sat uneasily on a throne few had expected him to occupy, his own position far from secure. Agrippina, watching from the margins of a court that had exiled her once already, understood the lesson of the past 4 years better than almost anyone alive. Proximity to power was no guarantee of safety, but distance from it guaranteed nothing at all, and she had no intention of remaining distant for long. Chapter 2: Exile and Return. Rome in the year 41 was a city trying to steady itself. 2 emperors had fallen within 4 years of each other, one by illness and paranoia, the other by the knives of his own guard. Claudius, thrust onto the throne almost by accident, spent his early reign working to prove he deserved it. Part of that effort meant undoing his predecessor's worst excesses, and recalling banished relatives was an easy, visible way to do so. Agrippina's return from the Pontine Islands fit neatly into that larger pattern of restoration. She came back to a Rome that had changed considerably in her absence. Her infant son, barely a toddler when she was exiled, was now a boy of nearly 4, raised largely by his aunt Domitia Lepida rather than by her. That gap mattered. Roman mothers of the aristocracy were rarely the primary caregivers, even under ordinary circumstances, but exile had stretched an already loose bond nearly to nothing. Whatever relationship Agrippina rebuilt with Lucius upon her return, she rebuilt from a considerable distance, both physical and emotional. Her first task, though, was not motherhood. It was survival, and in Rome survival meant remarriage, alliance, and careful positioning within a court still finding its balance. Agrippina married again shortly after her return, this time to a wealthy man named Gaius Sallustius Passienus Crispus, a former consul with considerable political standing of his own. Ancient sources are unkind about the marriage, suggesting it was less a partnership than a resource to be extracted. Whatever affection existed between them, the union gave Agrippina financial security and renewed social standing at a moment when both were essential to her. Claudius, meanwhile, was consolidating a reign that had begun on uncertain footing. He was a man the imperial family had spent decades treating as an embarrassment, mocked for a limp, a stammer, and habits that struck relatives as awkward rather than dignified. Those very qualities, ironically, had likely saved his life during Caligula's paranoid final years, since nobody bothered viewing him as a serious threat. Now emperor, he proved more capable than his family had ever credited him for. He expanded the empire's territory, reformed its legal administration, and worked, however imperfectly, to restore a sense of stability the previous decade had badly eroded. Claudius's own domestic life, however, was far from stable. His wife, Valeria Messalina, was a young, ambitious woman whose name would become, in later Roman memory, a byword for scheming and excess. Whether every scandal attached to her was accurate is difficult to say, since much of what survives comes from historians writing after her downfall, with every incentive to blacken her reputation further. What is clear is that Messalina wielded real influence at court, and that influence made her both powerful and, eventually, dangerously exposed. She had given Claudius 2 children, a daughter named Octavia and a son named Britannicus, both of whom would later intersect with Lucius's own life in ways nobody could have predicted in the early 40s. For several years, Agrippina existed at the edges of this court rather than its center. Her marriage to Passienus Crispus gave her comfort, but not real political weight, and Messalina had little interest in sharing influence with a rival whose bloodline ran as directly to Augustus as her own children's did. Ancient writers describe a quiet but persistent tension between the two women, one openly powerful through her marriage to the emperor, the other patiently waiting through hers. Agrippina was not a woman built for patience by temperament, but circumstance left her little alternative for the time being. She watched, she calculated, and she waited for an opening. That opening began to form around the year 47, when Passienus Crispus died, leaving Agrippina a widow once more, but this time a considerably wealthy one. His estate passed to her, giving Agrippina resources independent of any husband for the first time in her adult life. Rumors circulated, as they often did around sudden deaths of convenient timing, that she had poisoned him to inherit his fortune. No credible evidence supports the claim, and it likely says more about Agrippina's later reputation than about the actual circumstances of 47. What mattered practically was simpler. She was free again, wealthy, and positioned to consider her next move carefully. Her son, meanwhile, was growing into boyhood under tutors chosen to prepare him for a public life, regardless of how modest that life might eventually prove to be. Roman aristocratic education emphasized rhetoric above nearly everything else, since the ability to speak persuasively in the Senate or the courts determined a man's entire public trajectory. Lucius reportedly showed genuine aptitude in these early lessons, a quick memory paired with real charm when he chose to display it. Whether this reflected natural gift or simply the attentive tutoring available to a well-connected boy is impossible to separate cleanly. Either way, those close to him noted early on that he was unusually persuasive for his age. At Claudius's court, Messalina's behavior was growing increasingly reckless by most contemporary accounts, culminating in the year 48 in an episode that stunned even a city accustomed to imperial scandal. She reportedly went through a public marriage ceremony with a senator named Gaius Silius while still legally married to the emperor himself, an act of such open defiance that historians still debate what she could possibly have intended by it. Claudius's advisors, once they confirmed the reports, moved quickly and ruthlessly. Messalina was executed on Claudius's orders within days, her ally Silius put to death alongside her. The emperor, humiliated and shaken, was left with 2 young children and a court suddenly, urgently, in need of a new empress. That vacancy was precisely the opening Agrippina had spent years positioning herself to fill. She was Claudius's own niece, a fact that under ordinary Roman law and custom made marriage between them a legal impossibility bordering on incest. That obstacle, remarkably, proved surmountable. Advisors close to Claudius, recognizing the political value of uniting the emperor with a granddaughter of Augustus, pressed the Senate to formally revise the law permitting such marriages. The Senate complied, and in the year 49, Claudius and Agrippina were married, binding her, and by extension her son, directly into the innermost circle of imperial power at last. The marriage transformed Lucius's prospects overnight, though not without complication. Claudius already had a natural son in Britannicus, a boy roughly 3 years younger, who stood as the obvious and expected heir to the throne. Agrippina understood this arithmetic with total clarity from the moment her marriage was finalized. Being the emperor's wife secured her position at court, but it did nothing by itself to secure her son's future against a rival with a stronger biological claim. If Lucius was ever going to rise beyond the periphery of imperial life, his mother would need to engineer that rise herself, deliberately and without hesitation. She began almost immediately. One of her first acts as empress was securing the recall of a prominent philosopher and statesman from exile on the island of Corsica, a man whose reputation for eloquence and wisdom made him an obvious choice as tutor for an ambitious woman's son. That man was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, already well known in Roman intellectual circles before his banishment years earlier under Messalina's influence. Agrippina's decision to recall him was not sentimental. It was strategic, aimed squarely at giving her son an education and a public association that would set him apart from Britannicus in the eyes of Rome's political class. Seneca's return marked a genuine turning point, both for Lucius personally and for the broader trajectory of Agrippina's ambitions. Here was a man renowned throughout the empire for his command of rhetoric, his philosophical seriousness, and his literary output, now placed directly at the side of a boy not yet in his teens. The signal this sent to Roman society was unmistakable, whether or not it was ever stated outright. Agrippina was building something for her son that went well beyond ordinary aristocratic education, and everyone paying attention understood exactly what that something was aimed toward. By the close of the year 49, the pieces Agrippina needed were largely in place. She held the position of empress, a legal marriage the Senate itself had cleared the way for. Her son had access to the finest tutor available anywhere in the Roman world, cultivating a public reputation for promise and eloquence. Britannicus remained, technically, the stronger claimant by blood, a fact no amount of maneuvering could erase outright. But blood alone had never been sufficient in Roman succession, not in a system without any fixed law of inheritance for the throne, and Agrippina intended to make certain that whatever ultimately determined the succession, her son would not be left standing on the outside of it. Chapter 3: The Path to the Purple. By the year 50, Agrippina's ambitions had moved past mere positioning into open, deliberate strategy. She was empress in title and, increasingly, empress in practice, wielding an influence over Claudius that surprised even Romans accustomed to powerful women operating behind the throne. Her son, now 12, stood at the center of everything she was building. The question facing her was no longer whether Lucius might have a future in imperial politics. It was how quickly and how thoroughly she could secure that future before circumstances shifted against her. The most direct path lay through formal adoption, a legal mechanism with deep roots in Roman tradition and considerable precedent among the ruling class. Adoption was not viewed in Rome the way later societies would come to see it, as a lesser or secondary form of parentage. A father's adopted son carried the same legal standing, the same claim to inheritance and name, as any child born to him naturally. Augustus himself, the founder of the entire imperial system, had secured his own rise to power, partly through adoption by Julius Caesar. Agrippina understood this history intimately, and she pressed Claudius toward the same solution for her own son. Claudius's motivations for agreeing remain harder to reconstruct than Agrippina's. Some ancient sources suggest genuine affection had grown between the emperor and his new wife's clever, charming son, a boy Seneca's tutoring had sharpened into an impressive young orator. Other accounts lean toward a more calculating reading, suggesting Claudius saw political value in binding two young heirs together rather than leaving Britannicus to stand alone against whatever rivals might emerge as he grew older. Both explanations likely hold some truth. Claudius was neither a simple man nor an especially decisive one, and his choices in this period reflect a ruler weighing family sentiment against cold political arithmetic in roughly equal measure. The adoption became formal in February of the year 50, and with it Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus ceased to exist under that name entirely. He emerged from the ceremony as Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name that folded him directly into the Julio-Claudian line his mother had spent over a decade maneuvering toward. Each element of that new name carried weight. Nero itself was an old Claudian family name meaning, roughly, brave or vigorous, chosen deliberately to distinguish the boy from Britannicus and to root him in Claudius's own ancestral line rather than simply attaching him as an afterthought. Rome took notice immediately, and not merely as a matter of court gossip. An adopted son now stood formally ahead of a natural-born one in matters of protocol and public presentation, an arrangement unusual enough to draw comment even among senators well-versed in the family's tangled history. Nero was 3 years older than Britannicus, old enough that the age gap alone gave him a practical advantage regardless of legal standing. Whatever the underlying motivations, the adoption had effectively created two heirs where Rome had previously assumed only one, and everyone in the city understood that such arrangements rarely resolved themselves peacefully. Agrippina did not treat the adoption as an endpoint. It was, if anything, only the framework on which she intended to build something more permanent. Public appearances mattered enormously in Roman political culture, where reputation often counted for as much as formal legal standing. She ensured Nero appeared prominently at public games and ceremonies, presented consistently as poised, well-spoken, and comfortable before crowds that Britannicus, younger and less publicly cultivated, could not yet match. Every appearance was, in effect, a small campaign, conducted in full view of a city that would eventually have some say, formal or otherwise, in whichever boy inherited the throne. Seneca's role expanded considerably during this period, moving well beyond simple tutoring into something closer to political grooming. He shaped not just Nero's rhetorical skill, but his public image more broadly, coaching him in the kind of measured, thoughtful bearing that Roman audiences associated with a ruler rather than merely a promising young aristocrat. The philosopher's own reputation for wisdom and restraint reflected back onto his student, lending Nero an air of seriousness beyond his years. Whether that image matched the boy's actual temperament was a separate question entirely, one that would not fully reveal itself until years later. Claudius, for his part, continued reinforcing the arrangement through further honors. In the year 51, Nero received the toga virilis, the ceremonial garment marking a Roman boy's formal transition into manhood, at an age slightly younger than custom typically allowed. That same year, he was granted proconsular power outside Rome and named Princeps Juventutis, a title meaning leader of the youth that carried real symbolic weight within the imperial system. Augustus himself had once bestowed that same title on his own chosen heirs. The message embedded in each of these honors was becoming difficult for anyone in Rome to misread. Britannicus, meanwhile, occupied an increasingly uncomfortable position within his own father's household. He was Claudius's natural son, undeniably, carrying a name that itself commemorated his father's conquest of Britain. Yet every public honor flowing toward his adopted older brother seemed to push him further into the background of a succession that, by blood alone, should have belonged to him outright. Ancient sources suggest tension between the two boys existed from an early stage, though how much of that tension reflected genuine rivalry versus the political maneuvering of the adults around them remains difficult to untangle from this historical distance. Agrippina's influence over Claudius during these years extended well past matters concerning her son directly. She involved herself in appointments, in provincial administration, in the broader machinery of imperial governance, to a degree unprecedented for a Roman empress. Coins minted during this period carried her image alongside Claudius's own, an honor rarely extended to imperial wives, and one that signaled her practical standing at court more clearly than any formal title could. Some senators reportedly viewed her growing power with real unease, uncomfortable watching a woman wield this much visible authority within a system built almost entirely around male political actors. Whatever discomfort existed among the traditional aristocracy, Agrippina showed little inclination to slow her pace. She moved next to secure a marriage alliance that would bind Nero even more tightly to the imperial family, this time through Octavia, Claudius's own daughter by the disgraced Messalina. A betrothal between Nero and his adoptive sister would, once finalized, connect him to Claudius through two separate threads, adoption and marriage both. The arrangement required some legal maneuvering of its own, since Octavia had already been engaged to another young nobleman, an engagement conveniently dissolved once Agrippina's plans for her son took priority. The betrothal was finalized, and preparations began for an eventual marriage between Nero and Octavia, though the ceremony itself would not take place for a few more years yet. In the meantime, Nero continued his education under Seneca, continued his calculated public appearances, and continued accumulating the honors his mother and stepfather steadily arranged for him. He was, by the early 50s, no longer simply a promising boy with useful family connections. He had become, in the eyes of most of Rome, the clear favorite in an unofficial contest for succession that Claudius himself had never formally settled. Not everyone at court welcomed this trajectory, and resistance came from an unexpected corner. Britannicus retained loyal tutors and household staff of his own, some of whom resented watching their charge steadily eclipsed by his older adoptive brother. Small frictions surfaced periodically, arguments over precedence at ceremonies, disputes over which boy's household received particular honors first. None of these frictions rose to the level of open conflict during this period, but they revealed an undercurrent of tension that both boys, still only children by any reasonable measure, had inherited entirely from the ambitions of the adults surrounding them. By the year 53, the final major piece of Agrippina's design fell into place. Nero and Octavia were formally married, uniting him to Claudius's household through both adoption and marriage, in a manner few Roman successions had ever seen replicated so deliberately. He was 16 years old, already holding proconsular authority, already publicly favored over a natural-born son 3 years his junior, and now married into the direct bloodline of the reigning emperor. Whatever uncertainty had surrounded his prospects a decade earlier, when his mother returned from exile to a court that barely acknowledged either of them, had been almost entirely erased through a decade of relentless, patient maneuvering. Claudius, now in his early 60s and showing signs of declining health that worried those close to him, had effectively built a court with two potential heirs, one of whom held every practical advantage over the other. Whether this arrangement reflected the emperor's genuine wishes for the succession, or simply the accumulated momentum of his wife's ambition operating largely unchecked, remained an open question even among those who observed the court most closely. What was no longer in question, as the year 53 came to a close, was Nero's position relative to Britannicus. He stood older, more publicly cultivated, more thoroughly connected to the imperial family, and considerably closer to the throne than the boy who by blood alone should have been walking toward it uncontested. Chapter 4: The Death of Claudius. The year 54 opened with Claudius still firmly on the throne, but those closest to the court had begun noticing signs of a ruler whose grip on affairs was loosening. He was in his early 60s, an advanced age by Roman standards, and his health had grown noticeably fragile over the preceding year. More troubling to Agrippina than his physical decline was something else entirely, a pattern of small remarks and gestures that suggested Claudius might be reconsidering the succession he had spent years apparently settling in her son's favor. Nothing about this reconsideration was formal or announced. It existed instead in the accumulated weight of small signals, the kind court insiders learned to read as carefully as any official decree. Ancient historians point to a handful of specific moments that fed Agrippina's growing unease. Claudius was said to have shown increasing warmth toward Britannicus as the boy approached his own coming of age, embracing him publicly on at least one occasion, with a remark suggesting the boy would soon receive the honors due a true heir. Whether this reflected genuine paternal affection reasserting itself, or simply an old man's sentimentality as his natural son grew older, mattered less to Agrippina than the plain political danger it represented. Britannicus was due to take the toga virilis within the year, an event that would mark his own formal entry into adult public life and inevitably invite comparisons to the position Nero already held. Agrippina had spent over a decade building her son's position with total deliberation, and she was not a woman inclined to watch that work unravel through an old man's late life sentiment. Roman court politics in this period ran on rumor as much as fact, and rumors soon began circulating that Claudius intended to formally favor Britannicus over Nero in matters of succession, perhaps even reversing some of the honors already granted. Whether Claudius seriously entertained such a reversal, or whether the rumors simply reflected anxious court gossip feeding on itself, remains genuinely unclear even to modern historians working from the surviving sources. What is clear is that Agrippina treated the danger as real, and she acted with the same decisiveness that had defined every prior stage of her son's rise. The circumstances of Claudius's death, which came in October of the year 54, have never been fully settled by historians ancient or modern. The most widely repeated account, recorded by multiple Roman writers within a generation of the event, describes a meal at which the emperor was served a dish of mushrooms, a delicacy he was known to particularly enjoy. According to this account, the mushrooms had been poisoned, the poison administered through a food taster named Helotus, who answered ultimately to the palace household Agrippina controlled. Claudius reportedly fell ill quickly after the meal, then rallied briefly before a second fatal dose, possibly administered through a physician's feather used to induce vomiting, finished what the first had started. Not every ancient source accepts this version without qualification, and modern historians treat it with appropriate caution rather than settled fact. Claudius was, after all, an elderly man in genuinely poor health, and natural causes remain entirely plausible on medical grounds alone. What makes the poisoning account difficult to dismiss entirely is not any single piece of decisive evidence, but rather the surrounding circumstances, which aligned almost too neatly with Agrippina's interests. He died at precisely the moment his wavering favor threatened her son's position most acutely, and the timing alone was enough to convince most of Rome, then and since, that something more deliberate than illness had taken the emperor's life. Whatever the true cause, Agrippina's response in the hours immediately following Claudius's death revealed a woman who had planned for this moment with considerable care. She did not announce the emperor's death immediately. Instead, she kept the palace sealed, controlled who came and went, and ensured that Britannicus and his sisters remained confined to their quarters, effectively isolated from any senators or officials who might rally support around the natural son's claim. Meanwhile, astrologers were reportedly consulted to determine the most auspicious hour for revealing what had happened, a detail that speaks to how carefully choreographed the entire sequence was meant to appear once it finally unfolded publicly. The delay lasted through much of that day, hours during which the fate of the Roman world hung on decisions being made entirely within the sealed walls of the imperial palace. Nero, 17 years old at the time, was kept close during this period, prepared and positioned for the moment his mother judged right. When the doors finally opened, It was Nero who emerged first, presented to the palace guard, and gathered officials as the obvious, ready successor. Britannicus, only 13 and still formally a minor under Roman law regardless of his blood claim, remained inside, sidelined from the critical hours during which Rome's next ruler was effectively being decided. The Praetorian Guard proved decisive in what followed, just as it had proven decisive in nearly every imperial transition since the reign of Augustus. Burrus, the Guard's commanding prefect, had been placed in his position partly through Agrippina's own influence years earlier, a piece of long-term positioning that paid off precisely when it mattered most. Burrus presented Nero to the assembled Praetorians as the new emperor, and the Guard, whether out of genuine preference or simple recognition of where power had already settled, acclaimed him without meaningful resistance. Soldiers were promised a substantial donative, a customary cash payment marking the transition, which helped ensure their loyalty carried no hesitation. With the Guard secured, the Senate's response followed with a speed that reflected political reality more than genuine deliberation. Senators gathered that same day, formally confirming Nero's accession and voting him the full range of powers and titles an emperor traditionally held. There was little practical alternative available to them by that point. The Guard had already acted, the palace was already under Nero's effective control, and Britannicus, whatever his blood claim, held no independent base of military or political support capable of challenging what had already been decided elsewhere. Rome, within the span of a single day, had acquired its fifth emperor. Nero's accession speech to the Senate, delivered within days of taking power, struck a notably conciliatory tone that surprised some observers given how the transition itself had unfolded. He promised to govern according to the principles Augustus had established, to respect the Senate's traditional authority, and to avoid the private favoritism and hidden influence that had marked aspects of Claudius's own reign. Much of this speech, according to several ancient sources, had actually been drafted by Seneca, whose hand in shaping the young emperor's public presentation continued seamlessly from tutoring into active statecraft. The speech was well received, and for many senators wary after years of Claudius's sometimes erratic governance, it offered genuine reassurance about what the new reign might hold. Claudius himself received a funeral befitting an emperor, complete with formal deification voted by the Senate, elevating him officially to the status of a god within the Roman state religion. This was, in its own way, a politically useful gesture for Nero, as much as an honor for his adoptive father. A deified predecessor lent legitimacy to the successor, who now claimed descent, however indirect, from a god. Seneca, with a characteristic streak of dark wit that has survived in his other writings, later composed a satirical piece mocking the very deification ceremony he had presumably helped orchestrate in public, portraying Claudius's ascent to heaven as a bumbling, undignified affair. The private cynicism behind the public reverence tells its own quiet story about how genuinely the court believed in the honors it was formally bestowing. For Agrippina, the accession represented the culmination of everything she had worked toward since her return from exile more than a decade earlier. Her son sat on the throne of Rome, and she, as his mother, occupied a position of influence without real precedent among Roman women. She was granted honors previously reserved for emperors themselves, appeared at Nero's side during official ceremonies in a manner no prior empress or imperial mother had managed, and controlled access to her son with an authority that made her, in practical terms, one of the most powerful individuals in the entire empire. Coins were struck showing her image facing Nero's directly, an extraordinary visual statement of shared rule that unsettled traditionalists, even as it confirmed what everyone already understood about where real influence at court currently resided. Britannicus, meanwhile, occupied an increasingly precarious position within a household now formally headed by his own adoptive brother. He remained in the palace, still carrying the blood claim that Roman tradition would have favored under different circumstances, but stripped now of any realistic path toward the throne his father had once seemed to be steering back in his direction. Nero, for his part, showed no immediate hostility toward him in these early weeks, and some accounts even describe a period of outward cordiality between the two young men. Whether that cordiality reflected genuine feeling or simple political caution on Nero's part, newly enthroned and still finding his footing, would become clearer only as the months ahead unfolded. Rome, watching all of this unfold from outside the palace walls, greeted the transition with more relief than alarm. Claudius's reign, whatever its genuine accomplishments in administration and law, had never entirely escaped the shadow of scandal that Messalina's downfall had cast over it. A young, well-spoken new emperor, tutored by one of the empire's most respected philosophers, and promising a return to Augustan principles, offered the prospect of stability after years of uncertainty at the very top of Roman government. Nobody watching Nero's confident, carefully rehearsed accession could have easily predicted the direction his reign would eventually take. For the moment, in the closing months of the year 54, hope was the dominant mood, and Agrippina, standing at her son's side as the architect of everything that had brought them to this point, had every reason to believe the hardest part of her work was finally behind her. Chapter 5. The Quinquennium begins. Nero's first years on the throne would later be remembered by Roman writers as something close to a golden interlude, a phrase historians eventually shortened to the Quinquennium, the 5 good years. That label came from later admirers looking back with the benefit of hindsight, trying to salvage something praiseworthy from a reign that would ultimately collapse into infamy. In the moment itself, nobody in Rome used such a term. What they experienced instead was simply a young emperor governing with unusual restraint, guided closely by 2 men his mother had helped install at his side, long before the throne itself was ever in question. Those 2 men were Seneca and Burrus, and together they formed something close to a working regency, even though Nero technically held full imperial authority in his own right from the day of his accession. Seneca brought philosophical grounding and rhetorical polish, shaping the tone of Nero's public statements and steering him toward the kind of measured governance that echoed Augustus's own careful model. Burrus, as commander of the Praetorian Guard, brought military authority and a plainer, more practical sensibility, less concerned with elegant phrasing than with keeping the peace and the loyalty of the soldiers under his command. Between them, the 2 men balanced each other, and for a time that balance served Nero's reign well. One of the earliest and most telling decisions of the new administration concerned the Senate itself. Claudius had, in his later years, developed a reputation for bypassing senatorial authority, often handling important matters through freedmen and personal advisors rather than through proper constitutional channels. Nero's opening address had already promised a different approach, and in practice he largely kept that promise during these early years. Senators found themselves consulted on matters of real substance, treated with a formal courtesy that many had not experienced under Claudius, and Nero reportedly refused to sign a routine death sentence early in his reign, remarking that he wished he had never learned to write at all, rather than use that skill to end a man's life. That particular anecdote, preserved by more than one ancient source, captures something genuine about the tenor of these early years, whatever cynicism later events might invite about Nero's true character. Whether the sentiment came from the young emperor himself or from Seneca's careful coaching hardly mattered to the senators who heard it. It signaled restraint, a break from the arbitrary cruelty that had occasionally marked previous reigns, and Rome's political class responded with real relief. Executions for treason, so common under earlier emperors operating through fear and informers, grew markedly rarer during this period, a change contemporaries noticed and appreciated. Financial administration saw genuine reform as well, addressing problems that had built up gradually under Claudius without ever being seriously confronted. Tax collection in the provinces had long relied on a system that gave collectors considerable latitude to enrich themselves at the expense of local populations, a practice that bred resentment across the empire's territories. Nero's government moved to curb some of the worst abuses, publishing tax laws more openly so that provincials could better understand and contest unfair demands, and imposing tighter oversight on the officials responsible for collection. These were not dramatic, headline-grabbing reforms in the way later historians sometimes describe them, but rather incremental adjustments that nonetheless improved daily governance for ordinary people living far from Rome itself. The legal system underwent similar quiet improvement during this period. Nero's administration worked to speed up court proceedings, reducing the delays that had allowed cases to drag on for years and left defendants in prolonged uncertainty. Provisions were introduced to provide better legal representation for the poor, a population that had traditionally struggled to navigate Rome's complex judicial machinery without resources or connections. None of these measures overturned the fundamental inequalities built into Roman law, which still favored the wealthy and well-connected as a matter of course. But within that unequal framework, the adjustments Nero's government made represented real, tangible improvements that contemporaries recognized and credited to the new administration. Public entertainment, always central to a Roman emperor's relationship with his people, also flourished during these early years, though in ways that hinted at aspects of Nero's personality his advisors could not fully suppress even this early. He sponsored games and spectacles with genuine enthusiasm, more personally engaged in the details of these productions than most emperors typically bothered to be. Chariot racing held particular fascination for him, an interest some senators viewed with quiet unease even in these otherwise promising years. A Roman emperor was expected to sponsor such entertainments generously, certainly, but personal enthusiasm bordering on obsession struck traditionalists as somewhat beneath the dignity the office was meant to project. Foreign policy during the Quinquennium proceeded with similar competence, guided largely by experienced generals and administrators whom Seneca and Burrus helped select and support. In Armenia, long a contested buffer zone between Roman and Parthian interests, Nero's government backed a capable general named Corbulo, whose campaigns would eventually restore a measure of stability to a region that had frustrated Roman policy for years. Britain remained largely peaceful during this period as well, still absorbing the conquest Claudius had initiated over a decade earlier. These were not the personal military triumphs some earlier emperors had pursued directly, since Nero showed little interest in campaigning himself, but the empire's frontiers held steady under capable delegated leadership. Beneath this surface of competent governance, however, tensions were already beginning to surface within the palace itself, tensions that had little to do with Senate relations or provincial administration. Agrippina had expected her influence over her son's rule to continue essentially unchanged from the arrangement that had defined their relationship throughout his adolescence. She had, after all, engineered every step of his rise to power, and she saw no reason why the throne itself should alter the fundamental dynamic between mother and son. Nero, now emperor in fact as well as name, began experiencing that expectation rather differently, chafing quietly against a level of maternal control that had suited him well enough as a teenager, but sat far less comfortably on a young man who now held supreme authority over the Roman world. Early signs of this friction were subtle, barely noticeable to observers outside the palace's innermost circles. Agrippina reportedly attempted to sit alongside Nero during a formal audience with a foreign delegation, a gesture asserting her continued centrality to imperial governance that Seneca and Burrus quietly maneuvered to prevent, arranging matters so that Nero rose to greet her instead, a courteous but firm signal that shifted the meeting's optics without provoking open confrontation. Small moments like this one accumulated steadily during the Quinquennium's early months, each one testing the boundaries of a relationship that had never before required boundaries at all. Agrippina noticed these adjustments, and she did not receive them well. The coinage itself offers a visible record of this gradual shift, one modern historians have studied closely for exactly what it reveals. Early coins minted after Nero's accession showed Agrippina's portrait facing his directly, a striking visual statement of near equal authority that had unsettled traditionalists from the very start of the reign. Over the following months and years, that arrangement changed incrementally, with Agrippina's image gradually moved to a secondary position, smaller and less prominent, reflecting her steadily diminishing role in the actual machinery of governance. Whether this shift originated with Nero himself or with Seneca and Burrus working to reduce her influence on his behalf remains difficult to determine with certainty from the surviving evidence. Seneca and Burrus, for their part, had clear reasons to want Agrippina's direct influence curtailed, reasons that went beyond simple personal rivalry for the emperor's favor. Both men understood that stable governance required a clear chain of authority, and Agrippina's continued assertion of maternal control over imperial decisions threatened to undermine exactly that clarity. They worked carefully, never through open confrontation with a woman whose ruthlessness they understood better than almost anyone else in Rome, but through steady incremental adjustments to court protocol an access that gradually reduced her practical influence over her son's decisions. It was a delicate maneuver, conducted with considerable skill, and one that Agrippina recognized for exactly what it was almost as soon as it began. By the middle years of the Quinquennium, the Emperor Rome saw in public, restrained, thoughtful, guided by capable advisors, existed alongside a private situation growing steadily more complicated within the palace itself. Nero was young, not yet 20, suddenly possessed of absolute power after a childhood and adolescence spent almost entirely under his mother's careful direction. That combination, a young man discovering the full weight of unlimited authority while simultaneously trying to establish independence from the very woman who had delivered that authority to him, created pressures that Seneca's philosophy and Burrus's practical steadiness could manage for a time, but could not indefinitely contain. The good years were real, and Rome genuinely benefited from them. But the tensions building quietly beneath their surface were real as well, and they would not stay contained much longer. Chapter 6: Britannicus. By early 55, the surface calm of Nero's court had begun to show its first real cracks, and the pressure point was Britannicus. He was 14 that year, approaching the age at which Roman boys formally took the toga virilis and stepped into public adult life. For Britannicus, that milestone carried weight far beyond ordinary custom. Once he came of age, he would be old enough, in the eyes of many senators and much of the public, to be considered a legitimate rival for the throne his own father had once occupied. Agrippina understood this timeline as well as anyone in Rome, and her behavior in these months reflected a woman recalculating her position with characteristic speed. Her influence over Nero had been steadily curtailed by Seneca and Burrus since the earliest days of the reign, and she had grown increasingly frustrated watching decisions made without her direct involvement. Faced with that erosion, she appears to have begun reconsidering her options, and those options, troublingly for Nero, included Britannicus himself. A mother who had once orchestrated her son's rise to power was now, by several ancient accounts, quietly signaling that she might just as easily orchestrate his replacement. The evidence for this shift comes largely from Tacitus, writing decades later with access to court memoirs and testimony that have not survived independently. According to his account, Agrippina began showing unusual warmth toward Britannicus, a boy she had spent years politically sidelining in favor of her own son. She reportedly spoke of restoring him to his rightful position, of correcting what she now framed as an injustice done to Claudius's natural heir. Whether this represented genuine maternal reconsideration or simply a calculated threat aimed at reminding Nero how easily she could still reshape the succession, is impossible to know with certainty from this distance. What mattered to Nero was not the sincerity behind his mother's gestures, but the danger they represented regardless of her true intentions. He had spent his entire adolescence watching Agrippina engineer outcomes through patience, alliance, and ruthless timing. A woman capable of maneuvering an adopted son onto the throne over a natural-born rival was by definition capable of reversing that maneuver if she judged it advantageous. Nero's advisors, Seneca and Burrus among them, likely reinforced this fear rather than calming it, since both men had their own considerable stake in seeing Agrippina's influence contained rather than resurgent. Britannicus's own behavior around this time did little to ease the mounting suspicion surrounding him. Ancient sources describe an incident at a banquet during the Saturnalia festival, a period of licensed inversion in Roman society when normal social hierarchies were playfully suspended for a few days of celebration. Party games that evening reportedly required each young man present to perform something, sing, recite, or otherwise entertain the gathered guests, and Britannicus was called upon in his turn. Rather than choosing something light or celebratory, he sang a mournful piece about a dispossessed heir robbed of his rightful inheritance, its meaning unmistakable to everyone listening, including Nero himself. The room reportedly fell into an uncomfortable silence once the implication landed. Britannicus had not committed any crime, had not conspired with soldiers or senators, had not taken any concrete step toward reclaiming the throne he might reasonably feel was his by blood. He had simply sung a song, an act of public commentary rather than political action. But in the closed, suspicious atmosphere of an imperial court still adjusting to its new hierarchy, even a song carried real danger, and Nero's advisors would have registered the moment as exactly the kind of sentiment that, left unchecked, could eventually attract genuine political backing. Nero's response, according to the sources that survive, moved with a speed and coldness that stood in sharp contrast to the restrained young emperor Rome had come to expect during the Quinquennium. He turned to a woman named Locusta, a figure already notorious in Roman circles for her expertise in poisons, reportedly employed previously during the final, contested days of Claudius's own life. Locusta was given the task of preparing something for Britannicus, and her first attempt, administered through one of the boy's own tutors, apparently failed to work quickly enough, producing only mild illness rather than death. Nero, furious at the delay, is said to have summoned Locusta personally and threatened her with severe punishment if her next attempt proved similarly unreliable. The second attempt came at a family dinner in February of the year 55, staged with careful attention to appearances that only underscores how deliberately the entire episode was planned. Roman custom required that food and drink served to young nobles first be tasted by an attendant before reaching the intended recipient, a safeguard meant precisely to prevent poisoning of this kind. Britannicus's wine, according to the account preserved by Tacitus, was tasted safely at first, since the poison had been mixed into water used afterward to cool the drink rather than into the wine itself, a method designed specifically to slip past the taster's inspection. The boy drank, and the effect was almost immediate. Britannicus collapsed at the table within moments, his body convulsing violently in front of the assembled guests, unable to speak or breathe properly as the poison took hold. Panic spread through the room, guests rising from their couches, servants rushing forward uncertain what to do. Agrippina, watching her stepson die directly in front of her, is said to have shown visible shock, whether genuine or carefully performed for the benefit of everyone watching, remains a matter ancient writers themselves debated. Octavia, Britannicus's own sister and Nero's wife, reportedly sat rigid and silent through the entire episode, having already learned, young as she was, the particular danger of showing any reaction at all within this court. Nero's own response to the chaos unfolding at his table has become one of the most chilling details preserved from the entire episode. He remained reclining calmly, according to the account, and remarked to those nearby that Britannicus had simply suffered a seizure, a condition he claimed the boy had experienced since childhood and would recover from shortly. This was, on its face, a plausible enough explanation, since epilepsy was reasonably common and widely enough recognized in the ancient world that guests had little immediate cause to challenge it. But the calm, unhurried manner of Nero's explanation, offered before anyone could confirm whether the boy would recover at all, struck many present as considerably more disturbing than the death itself. Britannicus did not recover. He was pronounced dead within the hour, and his body, notably, was given only the barest ceremony before hasty cremation the following night, conducted during a heavy downpour that several ancient writers describe with clear symbolic intent, as though the heavens themselves were attempting to obscure what had happened. There was no lengthy period of public mourning, no state funeral befitting a son of the deified Claudius. The body was disposed of with a speed that itself told much of the story to anyone in Rome paying careful attention to how such things were normally handled. Nero's justification for this haste centered on the epilepsy explanation he had offered at the dinner table itself, now expanded into an official account distributed through the palace to the wider public. Britannicus, the story went, had suffered from a long-standing condition inherited, ironically, from his own father Claudius, who had experienced occasional seizures during his lifetime as well. The quick cremation, according to this official framing, was simply meant to spare the family further grief rather than prolong a painful public spectacle. Few among Rome's political class accepted this explanation at face value, though open skepticism carried obvious personal risk in the tense weeks that followed. The political calculation behind the killing was not difficult for contemporaries to work out, whatever the official story claimed. Britannicus, upon reaching legal adulthood within the year, would have represented the single most credible alternative claimant to the throne that existed anywhere in the empire. Nero, still young himself and only beginning to feel the full weight of ruling absolutely, could not risk allowing that alternative to mature into an active political threat, particularly with his own mother apparently signaling openness to exactly that outcome. The murder, brutal as it was, removed the uncertainty in a single decisive stroke, eliminating the last serious rival with a stronger blood claim to the throne than Nero's own. For Agrippina, the killing landed as something considerably more than a simple family tragedy. It was unmistakably a message aimed directly at her, delivered with a coldness that revealed just how far her son had already moved beyond her direct control. Whatever leverage she believed she held through her apparent overtures toward Britannicus had just been eliminated entirely, and the manner of its elimination made unmistakably clear that Nero was willing to kill, swiftly and without visible hesitation, to protect his position from threats that included members of his own family. The balance of power within the palace had shifted, permanently and unmistakably, in a single winter evening. Seneca and Burrus, for their part, appear to have offered no meaningful resistance to what had happened, whatever private reservations either man may have held. Both had built their considerable influence on managing and guiding Nero, rather than openly opposing him. and open opposition to an act already completed would have accomplished little beyond endangering their own positions at court. Instead, both men seem to have quietly absorbed the killing into the broader project of managing Nero's reign, helping shape the public explanation and working to ensure the incident did not destabilize the wider governing structure they had spent years carefully building around the young emperor. Rome itself absorbed the news with a mixture of quiet horror and careful public silence, the natural response of a political class that had learned, across generations of imperial rule, exactly how dangerous open commentary on such matters could prove. Senators who privately doubted the epilepsy story kept those doubts largely to themselves, offering the expected condolences and moving forward with the business of governance as though nothing troubling had occurred. This silence was not naivety. It was survival, a skill Rome's aristocracy had refined carefully across decades of unpredictable imperial temperament, and one that would prove increasingly necessary as Nero's reign continued to unfold. The killing of Britannicus marked a genuine turning point in how Nero's character was understood, both by his own court and, gradually, by the wider empire beyond it. The restrained, carefully tutored young emperor of the Quinquennium's opening years had just demonstrated, unmistakably, a willingness to kill a family member the moment that family member represented a credible threat. It was not yet clear, in the early months of 55, whether this single act represented an isolated necessity or the first visible sign of something deeper and more troubling in Nero's character. Agrippina, watching her influence collapse in the wake of a murder she had likely helped provoke through her own maneuvering, understood better than anyone else in Rome exactly how dangerous her son had already become and exactly how little control over him she now actually retained. Chapter 7. Breaking from Agrippina. In the years following Britannicus's death, the relationship between Nero and his mother continued deteriorating along a path that now seemed almost impossible to reverse. Agrippina had lost her last meaningful point of leverage the night her stepson died at that winter banquet, and she understood the loss clearly, even if she was unwilling to accept it quietly. She retreated somewhat from the center of court life in the months that followed, though retreat for a woman of her temperament rarely meant true withdrawal. She continued watching, continued positioning herself where she could, and continued making her displeasure known to anyone within the palace willing to listen. Nero, meanwhile, was discovering the particular freedoms that came with ruling as a young man increasingly unwilling to answer to anyone, least of all the mother who had once controlled every aspect of his upbringing. He was approaching 20, restless in ways that Seneca's philosophical guidance could shape but never fully contain, and he had begun exploring the private pleasures available to an emperor with essentially unlimited resources at his disposal. Late-night excursions through Rome's streets, sometimes in disguise, became a habit that unsettled his advisors without their being able to stop it entirely. These outings occasionally ended in brawls or petty vandalism, incidents quietly smoothed over by palace staff before they could become genuine scandal. It was within this atmosphere of loosening restraint that Poppaea Sabina entered Nero's life in any serious way, sometime around the year 58. She was already married at the time, to a rising young senator named Otho, a man who had been part of Nero's own inner social circle for years. Poppaea was renowned across Rome for her striking beauty, but ancient writers describe something beyond mere physical appeal, driving Nero's fascination with her. She was ambitious, sharp-witted, and by most accounts entirely capable of matching Agrippina's own political instincts, qualities that made her considerably more threatening to the empress than a simple romantic rival ever could have been. The affair developed gradually, complicated by the fact that Otho himself remained a close companion of Nero's throughout much of this period, apparently unaware for some time of exactly what was unfolding between his wife and his emperor. When the situation eventually became impossible to conceal, Nero resolved it in a manner characteristic of imperial convenience rather than personal scruple. Otho was dispatched to serve as governor of Lusitania, a province on the far western edge of the empire, a posting that removed him conveniently from Rome, while technically representing career advancement rather than open punishment. Whether Otho understood the true purpose behind his sudden appointment is impossible to say with certainty, though the timing left little room for genuine doubt among those watching from within the court. Agrippina's reaction to Poppaea's growing influence over her son was, by every surviving account, fierce and immediate. She recognized in Poppaea something she had never truly faced before in any of Nero's earlier romantic entanglements: a woman with genuine political ambition of her own, capable of reshaping the emperor's loyalties in ways that threatened Agrippina's remaining influence entirely. Ancient sources describe Agrippina attempting various strategies to break the relationship, from direct confrontation with her son to quieter maneuvering aimed at undermining Poppaea's position within the court. None of these efforts succeeded, and each apparent failure seemed only to widen the growing distance between mother and son. Poppaea, for her part, understood exactly how to exploit that distance to her own advantage. She reportedly pressed Nero relentlessly on the question of his mother's continued influence, framing Agrippina not merely as an inconvenience, but as an active danger to his rule, a woman whose ambitions had already proven themselves capable of reshaping succession once and could plausibly do so again. Whether Poppaea's warnings reflected genuine political insight or simple self-interested manipulation aimed at eliminating a rival for Nero's attention, the effect on Nero himself was substantial. He had already spent years growing wary of his mother's capacity for maneuvering behind his back, and Poppaea's persistent suspicion reinforced fears that required little encouragement to take firmer root. By the year 59, the situation between Nero and Agrippina had reached a point that both sides seemed to recognize as unsustainable. Agrippina, according to several ancient accounts, had begun making pointed remarks about Britannicus's murder in unguarded moments, reminders that carried an unmistakable threat beneath their surface, a woman signaling that she still possessed knowledge and standing capable of causing her son genuine political damage if she chose to use them. Nero, whatever restraint Seneca's tutoring had once instilled in him, had grown increasingly convinced that his mother represented not merely an irritant, but an existential threat to his continued rule. The question facing him was no longer whether to act against her, but how such an action could possibly be managed without destroying his own reputation in the process. Killing an emperor's mother, even one as widely feared and resented as Agrippina had become among much of Rome's aristocracy, was an act without real precedent in Roman imperial history. Nero could not simply order her execution through ordinary channels without inviting exactly the kind of public scandal he desperately needed to avoid. What emerged instead, according to the detailed account preserved by Tacitus, was an elaborate plan built around the appearance of accident rather than open violence. Nero reportedly consulted with a naval commander named Anicetus, a man who had once served as his childhood tutor and now commanded the fleet stationed near the Bay of Naples, about constructing a vessel specifically designed to collapse or sink on command while appearing entirely seaworthy under ordinary circumstances. The plan called for Agrippina to be invited to a reconciliation of sorts at Baiae, the fashionable resort town along the bay, where wealthy Romans maintained luxurious villas for escaping the city's heat and politics. Nero reportedly showed his mother unusual warmth during this visit, a performance of filial affection calculated to lower whatever suspicions she may have harbored about her son's true intentions. After an evening of apparent reconciliation, Agrippina was escorted toward her own villa aboard the specially constructed vessel, a boat designed with a collapsible section built into its structure and ceiling panels weighted to fall inward on command from crew members loyal to the conspiracy. The plan, elaborate as it was, went wrong almost immediately once put into motion. The ceiling panel meant to crush Agrippina collapsed as intended, but it struck and killed an attendant standing nearby rather than the Empress herself, who had been positioned slightly differently on her couch at the critical moment. The boat's collapsing sides, meant to tip the vessel and drown its passengers in the confusion, functioned imperfectly as well, and Agrippina, an accomplished swimmer despite the shock of the sudden chaos around her, managed to slip into the water and swim to safety, eventually rescued by a passing fishing boat that carried her back to shore, shaken but very much alive. Nero's reaction upon learning that his mother had survived the elaborate plot has been described by ancient writers as something approaching genuine panic. The entire scheme had depended on an appearance of tragic accident, and Agrippina, alive and almost certainly aware of exactly what had just been attempted against her, now represented a danger considerably more acute than before the failed plot. If she chose to expose what had happened, whether to the Praetorian Guard, to sympathetic senators, or simply to public opinion through carefully spread rumor, the consequences for Nero could prove genuinely catastrophic. He summoned Seneca and Burrus that same night, according to Tacitus, and the three men reportedly debated for hours what should be done given the crisis the failed assassination had just created. The account of that late-night council, whatever its precise details, ended with a grim consensus that Agrippina could not be allowed to survive the night, regardless of the risks involved in finishing what the collapsing boat had failed to accomplish. Burrus reportedly hesitated at the idea of using the Praetorian Guard directly for the killing, wary of exposing the soldiers most responsible for imperial security to an act that might undermine their loyalty if the true nature of Agrippina's death ever became widely known. Instead, the task fell to Anicetus once again, the naval commander whose earlier plan had already failed once and who now faced pressure to ensure that a second attempt carried no such margin for survival. A small detachment of men, led by Anicetus, made their way to Agrippina's villa near Baiae in the darkness following the failed boat plot, arriving to find her attended by only a small household staff, most having fled once news of the earlier disaster reached the villa. According to the detailed account that survives, Agrippina understood immediately, upon seeing armed men enter her chamber, exactly what their presence meant and exactly who had sent them. She reportedly offered no plea for mercy, choosing instead a final act of defiance that ancient writers preserved with evident admiration, despite everything else known about her ruthless character. She bared her stomach to the soldier assigned to strike the killing blow and told him to strike there, the womb that had borne the son now ordering her death. Whether this final detail reflects precise historical fact or the embellishment ancient historians frequently applied to dramatic deaths, it captures something essential about how Rome came to understand the relationship between mother and son by this final, brutal chapter of their shared story. Agrippina died that night in the year 59, killed on the direct order of the son she had spent decades maneuvering onto the throne through patience, alliance, poison, and sheer force of will. The woman who had survived Caligula's paranoia, Claudius's court, and years of careful political warfare against every rival who stood between her family and supreme power, had finally been undone by the very success of her own ambition, killed by the emperor she herself had created. Nero's response to his mother's death revealed the same careful attention to public perception that had shaped the failed boat plot from its earliest planning. He did not immediately announce what had actually occurred, and when word did reach Rome, it arrived wrapped in an official account claiming Agrippina had been discovered plotting against her son's life, forcing his hand in what was framed as an act of necessary self-defense rather than calculated matricide. Fabricated evidence was reportedly produced to support this version, including a supposed weapon planted on one of Agrippina's own attendants, meant to demonstrate that she had sent an assassin against Nero rather than the reverse having occurred. Seneca, whatever his private role in the night's grim deliberations, was tasked with drafting the formal letter Nero sent to the Senate explaining his mother's death, a document that leaned heavily on the self-defense narrative while carefully avoiding any explicit admission of what had truly taken place. The Senate, unsurprisingly, offered no meaningful challenge to this official account, voting instead to celebrate Nero's supposed deliverance from his mother's alleged treachery with public thanksgivings and ceremonies. Whatever senators privately believed about the true circumstances of Agrippina's death, open skepticism carried obvious and severe personal risk, and Rome's political class had learned that particular lesson thoroughly across the reigns of multiple emperors before Nero's own. The killing of Agrippina marked a genuine and permanent turning point in how Nero was perceived, both within Rome's political class and, gradually, among the wider public beyond the city itself. The murder of Britannicus 4 years earlier could at least be framed, however unconvincingly, as the elimination of a genuine political rival with a credible claim to the throne. Matricide admitted no such convenient framing. Ancient writers describe Nero himself as genuinely tormented in the months following his mother's death, reportedly suffering nightmares and claiming to see her ghost, whether from authentic guilt, simple nervous strain, or later embellishment designed to humanize an act that shocked even a Roman public accustomed to imperial ruthlessness. Whatever restraint had defined the early years of his reign was now unmistakably gone, replaced by a demonstrated willingness to eliminate even his own mother the moment she was judged a threat to his continued rule. Chapter 8: The Mask Slips. With Agrippina gone, the last major restraint on Nero's behavior had effectively disappeared, and the years that followed revealed a man increasingly unwilling to separate his private appetites from his public role as emperor. Seneca and Burrus remained at his side, still nominally guiding policy, but their influence over his personal conduct had weakened considerably since the days of the Quinquennium's careful early governance. Nero, now in his early 20s, had discovered that the throne granted him not just political power, but the freedom to indulge interests that many among Rome's traditional aristocracy considered beneath the dignity of imperial office entirely. Chief among these interests were chariot racing and the performing arts, both pursuits that occupied an oddly conflicted position within Roman culture. Rome loved spectacle without reservation, filling the Circus Maximus for chariot races and theaters for dramatic performances with an enthusiasm that crossed every level of society. What Roman tradition frowned upon, sometimes fiercely, was direct aristocratic participation in these entertainments rather than mere patronage of them. Watching chariots race was respectable. Driving one yourself, if you were a senator or worse, an emperor, was considered a scandalous blurring of social boundaries that had governed Roman public life for generations. Nero, however, showed little patience for that particular boundary, and his enthusiasm for both driving and performing grew steadily less private as his reign progressed. He began practicing chariot driving within the palace grounds initially, a pursuit his advisors could at least contain behind private walls where public scandal remained limited. Singing and lyre playing followed a similar trajectory, private lessons under skilled teachers gradually building toward performances that Nero increasingly wished to share beyond the palace's confines. Ancient sources describe him submitting to unusual physical regimens meant to strengthen and preserve his singing voice, including lying on his back with weights placed on his chest, a practice believed at the time to improve breath control and vocal projection. The dedication was genuine, whatever contemporaries thought of the pursuit itself, and Nero clearly wanted to be recognized as a serious artist rather than merely an emperor with an unusual hobby. Public performance, once Nero finally moved toward it, generated exactly the kind of unease among Rome's elite that his advisors had long anticipated. He first performed publicly in Naples rather than Rome itself, a city with stronger Greek cultural traditions and correspondingly greater comfort with the kind of artistic performance Nero wished to display. The audience response was reportedly enthusiastic, whether from genuine appreciation or simple prudence given who was performing, and Nero found the experience intoxicating in ways that alarmed those around him who understood how such enthusiasm might encourage even bolder public displays going forward. Word of the performance spread quickly back to Rome, where reception among the traditional aristocracy proved considerably cooler than the applause Nero had received in Naples itself. Tacitus and Suetonius both preserve accounts of senators privately horrified by their emperor's growing theatrical ambitions, viewing the behavior as a genuine threat to the dignity that Roman tradition demanded of imperial office. An emperor was meant to embody gravitas, a seriousness of bearing that separated the ruling class from entertainers and performers who occupied a considerably lower social standing despite their popularity with ordinary crowds. Nero's evident desire to be applauded as a performer rather than simply respected as a ruler struck many traditionalists as an inversion of proper hierarchy, the emperor lowering himself toward the very entertainers Roman society had always kept at arm's length from genuine political power. Alongside this growing theatrical obsession, Nero's marriage to Octavia had deteriorated into something close to open hostility, driven largely by his continuing relationship with Poppaea Sabina. Octavia had never been Nero's choice in any meaningful sense, married to him as a teenager purely as a mechanism in Agrippina's broader political engineering years earlier. Whatever affection may have existed between them at any point had long since evaporated, replaced by a marriage maintained purely for its political utility in connecting Nero to Claudius's bloodline. With Agrippina dead and no longer able to protect Octavia's position through her own political weight, that utility diminished considerably, leaving the marriage vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure Poppaea was fully prepared to apply. Poppaea pressed her advantage steadily throughout the early 60s, reportedly demanding that Nero formalize their relationship through marriage, rather than continuing an arrangement that left her without proper legal standing, despite her evident influence over the emperor himself. The obstacle remained Octavia, still married to Nero and still, despite her diminished political protection, popular among ordinary Romans who viewed her as a sympathetic, wronged figure trapped in an unhappy marriage not of her own choosing. Removing her required more than simple divorce, since divorce alone would not eliminate the public sympathy Octavia commanded, or the awkward reminder her continued presence represented of Nero's own increasingly erratic personal conduct. The solution, pursued through the year 62, followed a pattern of fabricated accusation that Nero's court had already employed once before against Agrippina herself. Octavia was formally accused of adultery, a charge nearly impossible to credit given how carefully guarded and monitored her movements had been throughout the marriage, and one that required considerable coercion of witnesses to sustain even superficially. One of her household slaves, reportedly tortured extensively to produce testimony against her mistress, apparently refused throughout the ordeal to confirm the accusations being demanded of her, declaring instead that Octavia's conduct had been entirely honorable. The formal case against her proceeded regardless, built on testimony extracted from more compliant witnesses, willing to say what the prosecution required. Nero divorced Octavia that same year, initially exiling her to Campania under a form of comfortable house arrest, rather than immediately imposing harsher punishment. Public reaction to her exile proved swift and genuinely alarming to the palace, with crowds in Rome reportedly gathering to celebrate rumors that Nero might reconsider and recall her, tearing down statues of Poppaea in open demonstrations of support for the wronged former empress. This unexpected outpouring of public sympathy forced Nero's hand in a direction considerably harsher than his original plan, since a popular Octavia living in comfortable exile represented an ongoing symbol around which discontent could continue gathering. Poppaea herself reportedly pressed hard for a more permanent resolution once the extent of public support for Octavia became clear. Octavia was recalled from her initial exile only to face renewed accusations, this time explicitly framed around treason and conspiracy rather than the earlier adultery charge that had proven so difficult to sustain convincingly. She was banished a second time to the small island of Pandateria, the same remote location where Augustus's own daughter had once been exiled generations earlier. Within days of arriving, soldiers were sent with orders for her execution, carried out through the opening of her veins in a bath, a method of enforced suicide Roman authorities frequently employed against condemned aristocrats to preserve at least the appearance of a voluntary death. She was barely into her 20s, killed for a marriage she had never sought and a political inconvenience she had done essentially nothing to create beyond simply existing as a popular reminder of the wife Nero had chosen to discard. Nero married Poppaea within days of Octavia's death, a haste that struck many contemporaries as confirming exactly what they had already suspected about the true motivations behind the entire sequence of accusations and exiles. Poppaea, now formally empress, brought a political shrewdness to the role that Octavia, sidelined and powerless throughout her own marriage, had never been permitted to exercise. Ancient sources describe her as genuinely influential over Nero's decisions in these years, though the specifics of that influence are harder to reconstruct in detail than the more dramatic circumstances surrounding her rise to the position itself. This same period brought significant change to the advisory structure that had guided Nero's reign since its earliest days. Burrus died in the year 62 from illness according to most accounts, though poison rumors circulated then as they seemed to circulate around every sudden death within Nero's court by this point in the reign. His death removed one half of the steadying partnership that had helped restrain Nero's worst impulses throughout the Quinquennium, and his replacement as Praetorian prefect, a man named Tigellinus, brought a markedly different sensibility to the position. Where Burrus had governed the guard with disciplined restraint, Tigellinus was widely regarded as a flatterer and enabler, a man who understood that his own position depended on encouraging rather than checking whatever impulses the emperor wished to indulge. Seneca, watching Burrus's death and Tigellinus's rise with evident unease, recognized that his own position at court had grown considerably more precarious without his longtime governing partner beside him. He formally requested permission to retire from active court life shortly after Burrus's death, citing his advanced age and a desire to devote himself to philosophy and writing rather than continued political service. Nero granted the request, though the parting carried an unmistakable coolness beneath its surface courtesy, and Seneca withdrew to private life, continuing his philosophical work from a comfortable but increasingly cautious distance from a court he no longer meaningfully influenced. The departure of both Burrus and Seneca from active governance within roughly the same period marked a genuine hinge point in Nero's reign, comparable in its significance to the earlier death of Britannicus or the killing of Agrippina herself. The men who had shaped the young emperor's early restraint, who had guided policy through the genuinely productive years of the Quinquennium, were now gone from meaningful influence, replaced by advisors like Tigellinus, who saw personal advancement in encouragement rather than restraint. Nero's private tastes, artistic ambition, and growing impatience with traditional boundaries no longer faced any serious internal check within the palace itself. Rome's aristocracy, watching these changes unfold across roughly 2 years, understood clearly that something fundamental had shifted in how the empire was being governed. The careful, consultative style of the reign's opening years had given way to something considerably more personal and unpredictable, driven increasingly by Nero's own tastes and Pompeia's ambitions rather than the measured counsel Seneca and Burrus had once provided. Senators adjusted accordingly, growing more cautious in their public statements, more attentive to which way imperial favor seemed to be shifting from month to month. The mask of restrained Augustan governance that had defined Nero's public image for nearly a decade was slipping badly by the mid-60s, and few among Rome's political class expected it to hold together very much longer. What remained uncertain, even to those watching most closely from within the palace itself, was exactly how far this shift might ultimately travel. Nero at 25 had already killed a stepbrother, ordered his own mother's death, and orchestrated the execution of a wife whose only real offense had been her inconvenient popularity. He had surrounded himself with advisors inclined to indulge rather than restrain his growing theatrical and artistic ambitions, and the traditional checks that Roman political culture had once relied upon to moderate imperial excess seemed increasingly absent from his court. Rome in these years remained outwardly stable, its administration still functioning, its frontiers still largely secure under capable generals operating far from the palace's internal drama. But the character of the man sitting on the throne had changed unmistakably since the hopeful early days of his accession, and that change was about to collide with a catastrophe that would test everything Rome thought it understood about its young emperor. Chapter 9: The City on Edge. By the year 64, Rome had grown into something no city planner of the ancient world had ever truly designed for. A sprawling, chaotic capital housing perhaps 1 million people within boundaries that had never been built to accommodate such numbers. The city's population had swelled steadily for generations, drawn by opportunity, imperial patronage, and the simple gravitational pull of being the center of the known world. Housing had not kept pace with that growth in any orderly fashion. Instead, Rome had filled in every available space with insulae, multi-story apartment blocks built quickly and cheaply, stacked close together along narrow, winding streets that had never been planned with fire safety or emergency access in mind. These apartment buildings, home to the overwhelming majority of ordinary Romans, varied enormously in quality depending on which floor a tenant could afford. Ground floor units, reserved for wealthier residents, were built with sturdier materials and offered direct access to the street. Upper floors, however, climbed higher with each passing decade as landlords sought to squeeze more paying tenants into the same footprint, using cheaper timber and increasingly precarious construction methods that building regulations struggled unsuccessfully to control. Some of these structures reportedly reached 6 or 7 stories, swaying and creaking under conditions that would have alarmed any modern engineer, packed with families who had little choice but to accept whatever housing their limited means could secure. Fire was an ever-present danger in a city built this way, and Romans understood the risk intimately even without modern building codes to formalize it. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and heating braziers burned constantly within these wooden structures, and any single spark carried the potential to spread rapidly through buildings packed so tightly against one another that flames could leap from one structure to the next almost without interruption. Rome had suffered serious fires before, and a rudimentary fire brigade, the Vigils, had existed since Augustus's reign specifically to address the recurring danger. Their resources, however, remained perpetually inadequate against a city that kept growing faster than any fire prevention infrastructure could reasonably match. Beyond the physical vulnerability of Rome's housing, deeper currents of social and political tension had been building steadily throughout Nero's reign, tensions that had little to do with architecture and everything to do with how the emperor's growing eccentricities were being received across different levels of Roman society. Among the traditional senatorial aristocracy, discontent had been accumulating for years, fed by Nero's theatrical ambitions, his executions of prominent family members, and his apparent disregard for the dignified restraint that Roman tradition expected from imperial office. This discontent rarely surfaced in open form, given the very real dangers of criticizing an emperor who had already demonstrated willingness to eliminate perceived threats within his own family. But it simmered nonetheless, expressed through careful private conversation and increasingly guarded public behavior among senators uncertain which direction imperial favor might shift next. Ordinary Romans, by contrast, often viewed Nero rather differently than the aristocracy did, a distinction worth understanding clearly before the events of that summer unfolded. The emperor's enthusiasm for chariot racing and public games, scandalous to traditionalists concerned with senatorial dignity, played considerably better among common crowds who filled the Circus Maximus and appreciated an emperor who seemed genuinely invested in the entertainments they themselves loved. Nero had also worked, particularly in the early years of his reign, to keep grain prices manageable and public spectacles frequent, both practical measures that mattered enormously to a population living close to the margins of subsistence in a crowded, expensive capital. This gap between aristocratic disdain and popular affection would matter considerably in how different segments of Roman society responded once catastrophe actually struck. Nero's personal ambitions extended well beyond performance and racing by this point in his reign, encompassing an evident desire to reshape Rome's physical landscape according to his own considerable artistic vision. He had already begun planning and commissioning architectural projects reflecting Greek aesthetic influences that departed noticeably from the more austere Roman building traditions favored by his predecessors. Existing structures throughout the city center, including some occupying prime real estate near the palace itself, stood as obstacles to whatever grander vision Nero was beginning to imagine for the capital he ruled. Ancient sources, writing after the fact and inclined towards suspicion given everything else known about Nero's character, would later point to this architectural ambition as circumstantial evidence bearing on what happened that July, though the connection remains, even now, a matter genuine historians continue debating rather than a settled fact. The summer of 64 arrived with conditions that, in retrospect, seemed almost designed to invite disaster. Rome had experienced a notably dry season, the kind of weather that left wooden structures and stored goods more combustible than usual across a city already vulnerable by simple virtue of its construction. grain stores, oil reserves, and the countless flammable materials that kept a metropolis of 1 million people fed, lit, and heated, all sat exposed within buildings that offered minimal protection against exactly the kind of catastrophic fire that had long remained, for Rome, a persistent danger rather than a distant memory. Anyone paying attention to the accumulated risk, the overcrowded housing, the dry conditions, the inadequate firefighting resources, might reasonably have predicted that a serious fire was less a question of if than simply when. Politically, the empire beyond Rome's walls remained largely stable during this same period, even as tensions within the capital itself continued accumulating. Corbulo's campaigns in Armenia had brought a measure of resolution to the long-contested eastern frontier, securing at least a temporary settlement with Parthia that reflected reasonably well on Nero's broader foreign policy, whatever his critics said about his personal conduct. Britain remained largely settled following the suppression of Boudicca's rebellion a few years earlier, an uprising that had briefly threatened Roman control before being decisively crushed. The provinces, in other words, offered Nero's government relatively little immediate cause for alarm, allowing attention and resources to remain concentrated on the capital itself and on the emperor's own increasingly elaborate personal and artistic projects. Within the palace, Poppaea's influence continued shaping court life considerably, though the specifics of her involvement in this particular period are harder to trace through the surviving sources than her more dramatic earlier maneuvering against Octavia. Tigellinus, now firmly established as Praetorian prefect following Burrus's death 2 years earlier, had consolidated his position as one of Nero's most trusted advisors, encouraging rather than restraining the emperor's various ambitions in ways that stood in sharp contrast to his more cautious predecessor. The governing structure that had once balanced Nero's impulses through Seneca's philosophy and Burrus's practical steadiness had given way to something considerably less inclined toward caution or restraint, a shift whose consequences would become starkly apparent once actual crisis arrived. Rome's grain supply, a perpetual concern for any administration governing a city this size, remained adequately managed through the early months of 64, drawing on the elaborate network of shipping and storage that brought food from across the Mediterranean to feed the capital's enormous population. This administrative competence, maintained even as other aspects of governance grew more erratic under Nero's personal direction, mattered enormously for how ordinary Romans experienced daily life, regardless of whatever drama was unfolding within aristocratic and senatorial circles. A population well fed, or at least adequately fed, tended toward patience that a hungry population rarely extended toward its rulers, and this basic administrative function would matter considerably once the coming catastrophe forced difficult questions about relief and recovery onto Nero's government. The physical layout of the city itself deserves particular attention here, since it would prove central to understanding how catastrophe, once it began, would be able to spread with such devastating speed and reach. Rome's 14 administrative regions varied enormously in their vulnerability, with the districts nearest the Circus Maximus densely packed with the kind of cheap, tightly clustered housing that sheltered the poorest residents, representing the most combustible sections of the entire capital. Shops selling flammable goods, oil merchants, and workshops using open flame for various trades clustered particularly thickly in these same crowded districts, adding fuel to what was already a precarious arrangement of wooden structures built dangerously close together along narrow streets, never designed to accommodate the emergency response such density would eventually require. Nero himself, in the weeks before catastrophe struck, was reportedly at Antium, the same coastal town where he had been born nearly 3 decades earlier, rather than in Rome itself. This detail would later carry considerable significance in how rumors surrounding the disaster took shape, since an emperor absent from the city when catastrophe struck offered fertile ground for suspicion regardless of the actual circumstances. Antium held genuine personal significance for Nero beyond mere convenience, and his presence there in July of 64 reflected a pattern of retreat to the coastal town that had already become fairly common during his reign, rather than any unusual or newly suspicious behavior on its own. The tensions accumulating across Rome by the summer of 64 then existed on multiple distinct levels simultaneously, each compounding the others in ways that would matter enormously once disaster actually struck. Physical vulnerability, built into the very structure of the city's overcrowded housing, sat alongside political vulnerability, an aristocracy increasingly uneasy about an emperor whose behavior grew less predictable with each passing year. Popular goodwill toward Nero, genuine among many ordinary Romans who appreciated his patronage of the entertainments they loved, coexisted uneasily with growing aristocratic contempt for exactly those same theatrical enthusiasms. And beneath all of this, an emperor increasingly surrounded by advisors, inclined to indulge rather than restrain his ambitions, including whatever architectural visions he may already have been nursing for a capital he seemed to view as somewhat beneath the grandeur he imagined for it. Nobody in Rome, whatever their position or perspective, could have predicted the precise scale of what was about to unfold that July. Fires were a recurring, familiar danger in a city built the way Rome had been built, serious enough to warrant a standing fire brigade, but not, in living memory, catastrophic enough to threaten the city's fundamental fabric. The accumulated vulnerabilities sitting quietly beneath the surface of daily Roman life, the dry summer conditions, the packed wooden housing, the narrow, unregulated streets, the inadequate firefighting resources stretched thin across an enormous population, were about to combine in ways that would test every assumption Rome held about its own resilience. The city that summer was, without anyone fully recognizing it, standing at the edge of something none of its own long history had quite prepared it to face. Chapter 10: The Great Fire. The fire began on the night of July 18th in the year 64, in the shops clustered around the Circus Maximus. These stalls sold oil, wood, and other combustible goods, packed tightly against the arena's southeastern curve. A single spark, its exact source never definitively established, caught in the dry summer air. Within minutes, it had become something no one on the scene could contain. Wind off the surrounding hills caught the flames almost immediately, driving them through the crowded shops and into the tightly packed insulae rising just beyond. The buildings, cheap timber stacked story upon story, offered the fire exactly the fuel it needed. Residents on upper floors, the poorest tenants in the city, had little warning and fewer ways to escape. Narrow stairwells clogged instantly, and many were trapped above streets already filling with smoke. The vigils responded quickly, but their equipment had never been built for a fire of this scale. Buckets and hand pumps could slow a single burning building. They could do almost nothing against flames now leaping freely from one packed insula to the next, racing along streets barely wide enough for two men to pass. Within hours, entire blocks near the circus were fully engulfed. Panic spread through the district faster than the flames themselves in some places, crowds surging through narrow alleys in the dark, trampling and colliding in the search for open ground. Some fled toward the Tiber, hoping the river might offer safety or at least a path out of the burning quarter. Others simply froze, disoriented by smoke and the roar of collapsing structures around them. Ancient accounts describe the confusion as total, a city that had never faced anything on this scale, suddenly discovering it had no coordinated way to respond. Nero was at Antium when the fire broke out, roughly 30 miles down the coast from Rome. Word reached him within a day, and by most surviving accounts, he returned to the city quickly once the scale of the disaster became clear. This detail matters, since later legend would insist he lingered comfortably at a distance while Rome burned. The timeline preserved by Tacitus, generally the most careful of the ancient sources on this episode, suggests otherwise. By the time Nero arrived, the fire had already burned for several days without meaningful containment. It had consumed the districts nearest the circus entirely and was pushing steadily into other parts of the city, driven by wind that refused to cooperate with any firefighting effort. Some ancient writers describe a brief lull around the 6th day, embers dying down enough that exhausted Romans allowed themselves to hope the worst had passed. Then, according to these same accounts, flames reignited in a different quarter entirely, reopening the disaster almost from the beginning. This second outbreak fed the darkest rumors that would eventually attach themselves to the catastrophe. A fire that seemed to die and then reignite elsewhere struck many contemporaries as suspicious, evidence of deliberate arson rather than accident or natural spread. Whether the second outbreak was genuinely separate or simply the same fire finding fresh fuel after a temporary lull is difficult to establish with certainty from this distance. What matters historically is that Romans living through it believed the worst, and that belief shaped everything that followed. In total, the fire burned for roughly 9 days, an extraordinary duration for any urban disaster in the ancient world. Tacitus records that of Rome's 14 administrative regions, only 4 escaped damage entirely. 3 were completely destroyed, reduced to ash and rubble with nothing left standing. The remaining 7 suffered serious damage, some buildings gutted while others survived only partially, a patchwork of destruction across the heart of the city. The human cost is harder to establish precisely than the property damage, since ancient sources rarely tracked casualty figures with the consistency modern readers might expect. What survives suggests the toll was severe, particularly among the poor who had lived in the most vulnerable upper-floor apartments with the least means of escape. Temples that had stood since the earliest days of the Republic burned alongside ordinary tenements. Centuries of accumulated art, records, and religious relics vanished in a matter of days, an irreplaceable loss that Romans understood immediately even amid the more urgent crisis of survival itself. Nero's actions once he returned to Rome, according to Tacitus's account, were considerably more active and responsible than the legend that later attached itself to him. He reportedly opened his own gardens and public buildings to house those left homeless by the fire, providing shelter for people who had lost everything in a matter of days. Emergency food supplies were brought in from neighboring towns, and grain prices were deliberately lowered to ensure the displaced population could still eat despite the chaos surrounding them. These measures, whatever came later, reflected a government responding to genuine catastrophe with real, if imperfect, urgency. None of this immediate relief effort was enough to stop the rumors already spreading through the traumatized city. Romans wanted an explanation for a disaster this total, and the explanation that spread fastest pointed directly at the emperor himself. Stories circulated that Nero had watched the fire from a private tower, that he had sung of the fall of Troy while his own capital burned around him, drawing a deliberate, self-glorifying parallel between himself and the ancient poets he so admired. This image, Nero fiddling while Rome burned, has survived more vividly than almost any other detail from his entire reign, despite being almost certainly false in its most familiar form. The fiddle itself is an anachronism, an instrument that did not exist in first-century Rome. Even the more accurate version of the story, involving a lyre rather than a fiddle, rests on shaky evidence at best. Tacitus, notably, records the rumor with open skepticism rather than presenting it as established fact, careful to note that Nero was documented as being at Antium when the fire first broke out. Suetonius, writing later and generally less careful than Tacitus about separating rumor from confirmed fact, repeats a version of the story with considerably less hesitation. This divergence between the two major sources matters enormously for how modern historians approach the episode. The safest conclusion available is that the legend, whatever its precise origin, reflects the deep public suspicion Nero had already earned through years of erratic behavior, rather than a documented fact about his actions during the fire itself. That suspicion did not emerge from nothing. Nero's reputation by 64 already included the murder of his own mother, the execution of his first wife, and a well-known enthusiasm for personal performance that many Romans found genuinely unsettling in an emperor. A population searching for someone to blame for an unprecedented catastrophe found, in Nero, a ruler whose prior conduct made almost any accusation seem plausible. The fire did not create Nero's reputation for callousness and self-regard. It simply gave that existing reputation somewhere terrible to land. The most damaging rumor of all held that Nero himself had ordered the fire set deliberately, clearing space in the crowded city center for the grand building projects he was already known to favor. This accusation, whether or not it held any truth, found fertile ground precisely because Nero's architectural ambitions were already well known throughout Rome before the fire ever broke out. Whether coincidence or something darker, the timing looked to a traumatized and grieving population considerably too convenient to dismiss. By the time the flames were finally extinguished after 9 days of destruction, Rome had lost a staggering portion of its physical fabric along with a measure of trust in its emperor that would never be fully restored. The relief efforts Nero organized, genuine as they were, could not outrun the suspicion that had already taken root in the ash and rubble. Whatever Nero actually did or did not do during those 9 terrible days, the fire had already begun reshaping how Rome understood him, and the emperor himself, sensing the danger in that shifting perception, would soon feel compelled to find someone else to blame. Chapter 11: Scapegoat and the Golden House. In the weeks following the fire, Nero faced a public relations crisis unlike anything he had encountered before. Rumors of his involvement were spreading fast, fed by his known architectural ambitions and his already tarnished reputation. Relief efforts alone were not enough to quiet the suspicion gripping the traumatized city. He needed urgently someone else for Rome to blame. The group he settled on was a small, still relatively obscure religious sect known as the Christians. Tacitus records that Nero directed the blame toward this community specifically, a population already viewed with suspicion by many Romans for their refusal to participate in traditional civic religious practices. Their exclusivity and unfamiliar rituals made them convenient targets, outsiders whose customs many Romans neither understood nor trusted. Nero's government seized on that existing unease and turned it into open persecution. The punishments that followed were deliberately public and deliberately brutal, designed as much for spectacle as for punishment itself. Tacitus describes Christians being torn apart by dogs, crucified, and in some cases set alight to serve as human torches, illuminating Nero's own gardens after dark. Even Tacitus, writing decades later with little sympathy for the sect itself, described these punishments as excessive, noting that public sentiment began shifting toward pity for the victims rather than satisfaction at seeing them punished. The persecution, intended to redirect anger away from Nero, risked instead reinforcing the very cruelty already associated with his name. Historians continue to debate how large this first persecution actually was, since later Christian tradition would considerably expand and dramatize the episode across the centuries that followed. What the earliest surviving sources agree on is that some real organized persecution did take place in Rome in the aftermath of the fire, and that Nero's government was responsible for directing it. Whether it achieved its intended purpose of shifting public blame away from the emperor himself is far less clear, and the suspicion surrounding Nero's own role in the fire never fully disappeared from Roman memory. Alongside this search for a scapegoat, Nero moved quickly to address the practical matter of rebuilding a city that had lost roughly 2/3 of its structures to the flames. Here, his government's response showed genuine competence, whatever else might be said about the emperor's character. New building codes were introduced, requiring wider streets to slow any future fires spread and limiting the height of new insulae to reduce the overcrowded vulnerability that had made the recent disaster so devastating. Building materials shifted as well, with greater use of fire-resistant stone and brick rather than the timber that had fed the flames so efficiently. These reforms represented some of the most forward-thinking urban planning Rome had seen in generations, and modern historians generally credit Nero's administration with genuine improvements to the city's basic safety and infrastructure. Fire hydrants of a sort, Communal water access points positioned strategically throughout rebuilt neighborhoods were also introduced as part of this broader effort. For ordinary Romans rebuilding their homes and livelihoods, these practical measures mattered considerably more than the political drama unfolding around questions of blame and rumor. It was within this rebuilding effort, however, that Nero's personal ambitions became impossible to separate from genuine public need, and it is here that the suspicion surrounding the fire found its most enduring fuel. A vast section of prime real estate in the heart of the city, land that had previously held crowded neighborhoods and had now been cleared by the fire, was claimed for an enormous new residence Nero intended entirely for himself. This project would become known to history as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and its scale shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial extravagance. The complex eventually sprawled across as much as 100 to 300 acres, depending on which ancient estimate is credited, encompassing pavilions, colonnades, artificial lakes, and landscaped grounds designed to evoke a countryside villa rather than an urban residence. This was land that had previously housed ordinary Romans, now repurposed entirely for the private pleasure of a single man. The symbolism was impossible to miss, and deeply damaging to whatever sympathy Nero's genuine relief efforts might otherwise have earned him. The interior matched the scale of the ground surrounding it. Ceilings were paneled with ivory and fitted with mechanisms allowing perfume to be sprayed down onto guests below. One dining room, according to Suetonius, featured a ceiling that could rotate slowly, mimicking the movement of the heavens above diners reclining at their meal. Gold leaf-covered walls throughout the complex extensively enough to give the residence its lasting name, a literal golden house built on ground that had, until recently, sheltered ordinary Roman families. At the entrance stood a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, reportedly over 100 feet tall, depicting the emperor in the guise of the sun god. The scale of this statue alone captured something essential about how Nero now understood his own place in the world. He was no longer simply governing Rome. He was positioning himself as something closer to divine, a self-image the fire's aftermath had given him unprecedented literal space to construct. Public reaction to the Domus Aurea, once its scale became apparent, compounded rather than eased the suspicion already surrounding Nero's role in the fire itself. A joke reportedly circulated through Rome at the time, suggesting that the whole city should relocate to nearby Veii, since Rome itself was about to become a single man's house. Whether the fire had truly been set deliberately to clear ground for this project remained, and remains, impossible to prove definitively. But the timing and scale of what Nero built on that cleared land made the accusation feel, to contemporaries, entirely plausible regardless of the actual evidence. Financing this extraordinary project placed considerable strain on imperial finances already stretched by the broader costs of rebuilding the city itself. Nero's government responded by debasing the currency, reducing the silver content in Roman coinage to stretch available resources further, a move that carried long-term economic consequences, extending well beyond his own reign. Provincial taxation also increased during this period, adding to burdens across an empire whose more distant territories had little direct stake in the emperor's personal architectural ambitions in the capital. The Domus Aurea then stood as a kind of physical monument to the contradictions defining Nero's entire reign by this point. Genuine public benefit, safer building codes, wider streets, improved infrastructure existed alongside a project of staggering personal indulgence built on the very ground that catastrophe had cleared. Ordinary Romans experienced both realities simultaneously, benefiting from genuine safety improvements while watching their emperor claim vast tracts of the rebuilt city for his own private pleasure. For Rome's traditional aristocracy, already uneasy about Nero's theatrical ambitions and his apparent disregard for the dignified restraint expected of imperial office, the Golden House confirmed every worst suspicion they had been nursing for years. Here was unmistakable evidence, built in gold and marble across hundreds of acres, of an emperor who valued personal glorification over the traditional responsibilities of his position. That resentment, simmering quietly through the earlier years of the reign, was hardening now into something considerably more dangerous among men who held both the resources and the connections necessary to act on it. By the time the worst of the rebuilding effort was underway, sometime in 65, Rome had absorbed an extraordinary sequence of trauma within a remarkably short span. The fire itself, the brutal persecution that followed, and now the visible golden evidence of where Nero's true priorities lay, had combined to erode whatever remaining goodwill his earlier years of competent governance had once earned him. The emperor, who had once refused to sign a routine execution order, unwilling even to use his own hand to end a man's life, now presided over a city rebuilt partly through forced blame and partly through a monument to his own self-image. That transformation had not happened overnight, but by 65 it was complete, and Rome's aristocracy was beginning, quietly and carefully, to consider what might be done about it. Chapter 12: The Pisonian Conspiracy. By the spring of the year 65, the quiet resentment that had been building among Rome's senatorial class for years finally began coalescing into something resembling an actual plan. The catalyst was a man named Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator of considerable wealth and personal charm, whose family background gave him exactly the kind of respectable standing a conspiracy of this magnitude required. Piso was not, by most accounts, a particularly forceful or decisive individual on his own. What he offered instead was legitimacy, a name and reputation broad enough to unite a genuinely diverse coalition of Romans who had grown convinced that Nero's continued rule threatened them personally, or threatened Rome itself, or often both at once. The conspirators who gathered around Piso represented an unusually wide cross-section of Roman society, a fact that speaks to how broadly Nero's erratic behavior had alienated different segments of the political and military establishment by this point. Senators disillusioned by years of arbitrary executions and theatrical excess sat alongside Praetorian officers, uneasy about serving an emperor increasingly detached from traditional standards of conduct. Poets and philosophers, drawn partly by genuine political conviction and partly by personal grievance against a ruler who had grown jealous of rival artistic talent, joined the plot as well. Even members of the equestrian class, Wealthy Romans just below full senatorial rank found their way into a conspiracy that ultimately drew participants from nearly every level of Rome's governing elite. Among the most notable conspirators was Gaius Piso himself, whose home became the natural gathering point for planning sessions conducted with considerable caution given the obvious dangers involved. Faenius Rufus, one of the two Praetorian prefects serving alongside Tigellinus, lent the plot crucial military weight, since any successful move against an emperor required at least some cooperation from the guard responsible for his personal protection. Subrius Flavus and Sulpicius Asper, both military tribunes within the Praetorian ranks, brought additional armed support drawn directly from within the palace's own protective apparatus. The presence of these officers made the conspiracy considerably more dangerous to Nero than earlier isolated grumbling had ever been, since it now included men with direct practical access to the emperor's person. Perhaps the most poignant participant, at least in how later history would remember the episode, was the poet Lucan, nephew of Seneca himself, and a literary talent whose early promise had once earned him genuine favor at Nero's court. That favor had curdled into bitter rivalry after Nero, jealous of Lucan's growing reputation as a poet potentially surpassing his own considerable but still amateur talents, had banned him from further public recitation. Lucan's resentment over this artistic suppression fed directly into his willingness to join a plot aimed at removing the emperor entirely, a reminder that Nero's insecurities about his own artistic standing carried genuine political consequences, extending well beyond mere court gossip. The plan itself, as it developed through the spring of 65, centered on assassinating Nero during the Ceres Games, a major public festival that would draw the emperor into a setting where the conspirators believed they could arrange an opportunity for a fatal strike. Various specific schemes were reportedly debated among the plotters, including one proposal to have a senator named Flavius Scaevinus approach Nero directly with a concealed dagger under the pretext of some routine business. Once Nero was dead, the plan called for Piso to be proclaimed emperor in his place, presented to the Praetorian Guard and the Senate as a restoration of dignified, traditional governance after years of theatrical excess and arbitrary cruelty. What ultimately unraveled this carefully constructed plot was not any failure of planning, but rather the simple, persistent danger that had doomed conspiracies throughout Roman history, the difficulty of keeping a secret among a group large enough to actually accomplish anything. Scaevinus, the senator tasked with delivering the fatal blow, reportedly grew visibly agitated in the days before the planned assassination, sharpening an old dagger with unusual, obsessive attention and freeing a slave along with making other preparations that struck his own household as distinctly unusual. His freedman, a man named Milicus, noticed these behaviors and grew suspicious enough to report them directly to imperial authorities, whether from genuine loyalty to Nero or simple calculation about which side of the coming confrontation offered better prospects for reward. Nero's security apparatus, once alerted, moved with a speed and ruthlessness that reflected years of practiced paranoia within the palace. Scaevinus was arrested and interrogated immediately, and under pressure he began naming other conspirators, setting off a cascading wave of arrests that spread rapidly through the network Piso and his allies had spent months carefully assembling. Within days, the conspiracy that had taken considerable time and effort to construct collapsed entirely. Its participants rounded up faster than they could organize any coordinated response or flee the city ahead of capture. Piso himself, recognizing that the plot had failed beyond any hope of recovery, chose suicide rather than face the formal trial and inevitable execution that capture would have guaranteed. This was, in Roman aristocratic tradition, considered a more dignified end than whatever public humiliation Nero's court might otherwise impose, preserving at least some measure of honor and protecting his family's property from the confiscation that formal conviction for treason typically triggered. Other conspirators faced similar choices in the days that followed, opening their veins in private rather than waiting for soldiers to arrive with orders for their public execution. The purge that followed extended considerably beyond the conspiracy's actual participants, sweeping up individuals whose connection to the plot ranged from genuine involvement to the barest suspicion, and in some cases to no real connection at all beyond simple proximity to those under suspicion. Nero, thoroughly alarmed by how close the plot had come to succeeding and by how deep its roots had run within his own Praetorian Guard, showed little inclination toward careful discrimination between genuine threats and convenient targets for eliminating long-standing grievances. The atmosphere within Rome's aristocracy during these weeks grew genuinely terrifying. Senators uncertain whether the next knock at their door might bring soldiers with a forced suicide order attached to nothing more than a rumor or a personal enemy's accusation. Seneca himself, retired from active court life for several years by this point, but never entirely free of Nero's suspicion, given his family's obvious connections to several conspirators, was implicated in the purge that followed, though the evidence tying him directly to the actual plot remains thin even by the standards of the period. Whether Seneca had genuine knowledge of the conspiracy, had been approached by the plotters, or was simply too prominent and too connected to escape suspicion once the purge began sweeping through Rome's elite, cannot be established with full certainty from the surviving sources. Nero, in any case, sent orders for his former tutor's death, a command that arrived at Seneca's villa outside Rome with the particular coldness that had come to characterize the emperor's dealings with those who had once shaped his own upbringing. Seneca's death, as later Roman writers described it, unfolded with a composure that made it one of the most famous episodes in the entire literature of Stoic philosophy, the very tradition Seneca had spent his life teaching and writing about. He reportedly gathered his household and close friends around him, opened his veins in the traditional manner, and continued dictating philosophical reflections to a scribe, even as his life slowly ebbed away over the following hours. When the bleeding proved too slow, he reportedly took poison as well, and finally entered a heated bath to accelerate the loss of blood, dying with a calm deliberateness that ancient writers, whatever their views on Nero, treated with genuine admiration. Lucan's death followed a similarly staged pattern of composed final defiance, though with its own distinct character, reflecting his identity as a poet rather than a philosopher. According to the accounts that survive, he opened his veins and, as death approached, recited lines from his own epic poem describing a soldier's death from wounds remarkably similar to his own circumstances, a final artistic gesture from a man whose literary talent had, in some measure, contributed to the jealousy that ultimately cost him his life. The scene captures something genuinely poignant about the broader tragedy of the Pisonian conspiracy's aftermath: talented, accomplished Romans meeting their deaths with a dignity that stood in sharp, deliberate contrast to the emperor who had ordered their end. Faenius Rufus, the Praetorian prefect whose involvement had given the conspiracy its most dangerous military backing, was also executed once his participation became clear, along with several other officers whose positions within the guard had made their betrayal particularly alarming to Nero personally. Tigellinus, the surviving Praetorian prefect who had not been implicated in the plot, used the purge that followed to consolidate his own position considerably, eliminating rivals and positioning himself as the emperor's most trusted and indispensable advisor. This consolidation would prove significant in the years ahead, as Tigellinus's influence over Nero grew steadily less checked by any rival voice within the palace capable of offering genuinely independent counsel. The scale of the purge, once fully tallied, was genuinely staggering by the standards even of a reign that had already seen considerable bloodshed among Rome's elite. Ancient sources suggest dozens of prominent Romans died in the weeks following the conspiracy's discovery, some executed outright, many more choosing suicide to preserve family honor and property, and still others exiled from Rome entirely on suspicion that never rose to the level of formal conviction. The Senate itself, already thinned by years of Nero's earlier purges targeting perceived rivals and critics, lost yet another significant portion of its most capable and independent-minded members in this single, concentrated wave of retribution. For Nero personally, the failed conspiracy appears to have deepened an already considerable paranoia, rather than reassuring him of his own security. The plot had, after all, drawn support from within his own Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers specifically tasked with his personal protection, a betrayal that struck at the most fundamental assumption underlying his continued rule. If the Guard itself could not be fully trusted, then no institutional safeguard remained reliably secure, and Nero's subsequent behavior reflected exactly this anxious recognition, growing increasingly reliant on informers and increasingly suspicious of anyone whose loyalty could not be absolutely guaranteed through fear or reward. Rome's aristocracy, watching the purge unfold and claim so many prominent lives across such a compressed span of weeks, absorbed a lesson that would shape political behavior for the remainder of Nero's reign. Open conspiracy, however carefully planned and however broad its coalition of support, carried catastrophic risk if discovered, and the Pisonian plot's failure demonstrated just how easily such a conspiracy could unravel through a single suspicious household slave or a single conspirator's nervous, obvious preparation. Future opposition to Nero, when it eventually came, would need to look considerably different from Piso's coalition of senators and disgruntled officers meeting quietly in private homes to plan an assassination doomed in the end by its own scale and its own accumulated secrets. The conspiracy's failure also left a permanent, visible mark on Rome's cultural and intellectual life, one that extended well beyond the immediate political calculations of who lived and who died in its aftermath. Seneca and Lucan represented two of the most significant literary and philosophical voices Rome had produced within a generation, and their deaths, alongside the executions and exiles of numerous other talented and accomplished individuals swept up in the same purge, represented a genuine loss to Roman intellectual culture that contemporaries recognized even amid the political terror surrounding the episode. Nero, who had once positioned himself as a patron and practitioner of the arts, had now presided over the destruction of two of the era's most gifted literary figures, a contradiction that would only deepen as his own artistic ambitions grew more consuming in the years that remained to his reign. Chapter 13: The Emperor as Performer. By the year 66, with the Pisonian conspiracy crushed and its participants dead or exiled, Nero turned his attention toward an ambition he had nursed for years, a formal tour of Greece devoted entirely to his artistic pursuits. Greece held a special place in Nero's imagination, home to the great musical and dramatic competitions that Roman culture had always treated with a mixture of admiration and faint condescension. He intended to compete personally in these contests, not as an emperor accepting ceremonial honors, but as a genuine artist measured against the finest performers of the age. The scale of preparation for this tour reflected how seriously Nero took the undertaking. The Greeks, aware of exactly who would be competing and exactly how much political consequence hung on the outcome, rearranged their traditional festival calendar entirely to accommodate him. The Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, and the Nemean Games, normally held across a staggered 4-year cycle, were all compressed into a single year so that Nero could participate in every major competition during one extended visit. Nero arrived in Greece with an enormous retinue, including members of the Praetorian Guard, court officials, and a claque of paid supporters whose job was to lead enthusiastic applause at every performance he gave. This last detail mattered considerably, since Nero's insecurity about his own talent, whatever its actual merit, ran deep enough that he wanted the appearance of overwhelming acclaim guaranteed, rather than left to chance. Ancient sources describe strict rules governing audience behavior during his performances, including prohibitions against leaving the theater for any reason, even medical emergencies, while the emperor sang. He competed across an extraordinary range of disciplines during his time in Greece, including singing, lyre playing, and chariot racing, the last of which carried genuine physical danger that Nero seems to have embraced rather than avoided. At the Olympic Games specifically, he entered a 10-horse chariot race, a configuration so difficult to control that even experienced charioteers approached it with real caution. Nero was thrown from the chariot during the race and failed to finish, an outcome that would have disqualified any ordinary competitor without question or controversy. The judges, fully aware of the consequences awaiting anyone who ruled against the Emperor of Rome, awarded him the victory regardless, reasoning that he would certainly have won had he managed to complete the race. This pattern repeated itself across nearly every competition Nero entered throughout the tour. He won, by official record, every single contest he participated in, an outcome so statistically implausible that even contemporaries understood exactly what was actually happening beneath the formal ceremony of victory. Nero received, by the end of his tour, some 1,108 crowns of victory, an almost absurd tally reflecting not genuine artistic superiority, but rather the desperate accommodation of local officials terrified of offending a man who held absolute power over the entire Mediterranean world. The Greeks, for their part, proved remarkably skilled at managing this delicate situation, offering Nero exactly the adoration he craved while extracting real political benefits in return for their cooperation. Flattery, in this context, functioned as a genuinely effective diplomatic tool. That benefit arrived in dramatic form at the Isthmian Games, held near Corinth, where Nero made a formal public announcement that stunned the assembled crowd. He declared Greece entirely free, releasing the province from the taxation and direct governmental oversight that Roman rule typically imposed on its territories. This was, in practical terms, an extraordinary gift, one that reflected Nero's genuine affection for Greek culture even as it demonstrated, once again, his tendency to make sweeping decisions based on personal enthusiasm rather than careful, considered statecraft weighing the empire's broader interests. The declaration, whatever its emotional sincerity, created real administrative complications that would eventually require reversal under a later emperor, since a major province operating outside the normal framework of taxation and provincial governance introduced exactly the kind of inconsistency that undermined the broader imperial system's functioning. In the moment, however, Nero's gesture was received with genuine, overwhelming gratitude throughout Greece, cementing an image of the emperor as a devoted friend and patron of Hellenic culture that stood in sharp contrast to how he was increasingly viewed back in Rome itself. That contrast mattered enormously, and it points toward the real cost of Nero's extended absence from the capital during this period. While he toured Greece competing in athletic and artistic contests, Rome itself continued functioning, but without the direct attention and oversight that governance of an empire this size genuinely required. Administrative matters piled up, decisions awaited the emperor's return, and the machinery of imperial government, already strained by years of erratic priorities under Nero's rule, grew increasingly dependent on subordinates operating without clear direction from the top. Helius, a freedman Nero had left in charge of Rome during his absence, wielded enormous practical authority throughout this period, a situation that deeply unsettled the traditional senatorial aristocracy, already uneasy about how Roman governance was being conducted. A freedman, a former slave, now effectively running the capital while the emperor pursued musical competitions abroad, struck many Romans as a genuine inversion of proper hierarchy, compounding resentments that had already been building for years over Nero's various departures from expected imperial conduct. Reports eventually reached Nero in Greece, suggesting real unrest was building back in Rome, discontent serious enough that Helius himself reportedly traveled to Greece personally to warn the emperor that his continued absence risked genuine political danger. Nero, absorbed in his competitions and evidently reluctant to abandon the adoration he was receiving throughout Greece, delayed his return considerably longer than prudent governance would have suggested. This delay would prove significant, since the discontent building in his absence was not confined merely to administrative frustration. Financial pressures compounded the growing unease during this same period. The costs of rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire, combined with the enormous expense of constructing the Domus Aurea, and now the considerable costs of Nero's extended Greek tour itself, were placing real strain on imperial finances that provincial taxation and currency debasement could only partially offset. These financial pressures would eventually translate into demands on the provinces, demands that fed directly into the unrest already building in territories far from Rome's own internal political drama. When Nero finally did return to Italy, sometime in late 67 or early 68, he staged an elaborate triumphal entry into Rome, modeled deliberately on the traditional celebrations Roman generals received after major military victories. He entered the city through a breach specially made in the walls, a gesture traditionally reserved for the most extraordinary military triumphs, riding in Augustus's own ancient chariot and wearing a crown of olive from Olympia alongside the laurel crown of Delphi. His 1,008 victory crowns were displayed prominently throughout the procession, along with placards announcing exactly which contests he had won and against which rivals. This triumph, celebrating athletic and artistic victories rather than military conquest, struck much of Rome's traditional aristocracy as a genuine embarrassment, a further confirmation that their emperor had fundamentally misunderstood what Roman leadership was actually supposed to represent. Ordinary Romans, watching the spectacle unfold, responded with more genuine enthusiasm than the senatorial class managed, since public celebration and imperial generosity toward the crowds still carried real popular appeal regardless of aristocratic disdain. This gap between elite contempt and popular indulgence, however, was narrowing dangerously by this point in the reign. What Nero could not see clearly, absorbed as he was in the genuine artistic triumph he believed his Greek tour represented, was how thoroughly his prolonged absence had allowed existing grievances to harden into something considerably more dangerous than simple disapproval. Provincial governors, military commanders, and disaffected senators had all had many months to observe an emperor seemingly more interested in theatrical competition than in the practical business of ruling an empire. That observation, quietly shared and quietly discussed across considerable distances during Nero's extended absence, was about to translate into action that would threaten his rule far more seriously than any conspiracy hatched within Rome itself. Chapter 14: The Ground Gives Way. The first serious crack in Nero's authority appeared in Gaul in the early months of 68, when Gaius Julius Vithdex, governor of the province of Gallia Lugdunensis, raised open revolt against the emperor. Vithdex was himself of Gallic aristocratic descent, a man who had absorbed Roman citizenship and administrative rank without losing a certain outsider's clarity about how badly Nero's rule had drifted from anything resembling responsible governance. His rebellion was framed carefully, not as a rejection of Roman rule itself, but as a call for Nero specifically to be removed and replaced with someone more worthy of the office. Vindex lacked the military strength to challenge Rome directly on his own, and he understood this limitation clearly enough to seek support elsewhere rather than attempting a doomed solo uprising. He turned to Servius Sulpicius Galba, the aging governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, a province in Spain, urging him to claim the throne himself and lend the rebellion the legitimacy that only a figure of Galba's standing could provide. Galba was already in his early 70s, a man with decades of respected military and administrative service behind him, precisely the kind of traditional, dignified figure that contrasted so sharply with everything Nero had come to represent. Galba's decision to accept Vindex's offer did not come quickly or without considerable hesitation, given the enormous risk involved in openly declaring against a sitting emperor. Roman history offered no shortage of examples of provincial governors who had attempted exactly this kind of challenge and paid for the attempt with their lives. But by the spring of 68, Galba judged that the accumulated resentment toward Nero across the empire's administrative and military class had grown deep enough to make the gamble worthwhile, and he allowed himself to be proclaimed emperor by his own troops in Spain. Nero's response to these developing threats revealed just how disconnected he had become from the practical realities of imperial governance by this point in his reign. Rather than moving decisively to suppress the rebellion through direct military action, he reportedly spent considerable time preoccupied with matters of far less consequence, including plans for new theatrical performances and elaborate schemes for punishing Vindex through methods more suited to personal spite than serious strategic response. Ancient sources describe him treating the entire crisis with a curious detachment, as though the practical business of suppressing rebellion interested him considerably less than his own continuing artistic ambitions. The imperial legions stationed in Germany under the command of a general named Verginius Rufus did move against Vindex's forces directly, and the resulting engagement near Vesontio ended in Vindex's decisive defeat and subsequent suicide. On its surface, this outcome should have represented a clear victory for Nero, eliminating the rebellion's original instigator through conventional military force. In practice, the episode revealed something considerably more troubling for the emperor's position, since Verginius Rufus's own troops, having won the battle, reportedly offered to proclaim their own general emperor in Nero's place, an offer Verginius notably declined without ever reaffirming clear loyalty to Nero himself. That refusal to declare unambiguous support, even from the general whose forces had just defeated the rebellion's leader, sent an unmistakable signal throughout the Roman military establishment about how precarious Nero's position had genuinely become. If legions victorious on his behalf would not commit clearly to his continued rule, the deeper structural loyalty an emperor required from his armed forces was clearly eroding in ways that Vindex's death alone could not repair. Galba, watching these developments from Spain, understood that Vindex's defeat had not resolved the underlying crisis at all, and he continued positioning himself as the alternative Rome's discontented provinces and military commanders increasingly seemed to want. Rome's political establishment, watching this unfolding crisis from the capital itself, grew increasingly convinced that Nero's position was no longer sustainable, whatever the formal outcome of any individual battle might suggest. The Senate, historically cautious about openly challenging a sitting emperor given the severe risks involved, began quietly testing the possibility of formally abandoning Nero in favor of Galba, watching carefully for signs of how the Praetorian Guard, the single institution whose loyalty ultimately determined any emperor's practical survival, might respond to such a dramatic shift. That question was answered decisively when Nymphidius Sabinus, one of the two Praetorian prefects serving at this point in the reign, made the calculated decision to abandon Nero entirely and throw his considerable influence behind Galba instead. Nymphidius promised the Praetorian Guard an enormous donative, a cash payment considerably larger than customary, in exchange for their support of Galba's claim to the throne. The Guard, whose loyalty had always depended significantly on exactly this kind of financial incentive, rather than any deeper ideological commitment to a particular emperor, accepted the offer and formally abandoned Nero without meaningful resistance. This defection proved catastrophic for Nero in ways that went well beyond simple military calculation. The Praetorian Guard represented the single institution specifically tasked with protecting the emperor's own person, and its abandonment meant Nero no longer possessed any reliable armed force capable of defending him against whatever might come next. The Senate, watching the Guard's defection unfold, moved quickly to formalize what had already become politically inevitable, declaring Nero a public enemy and voting to strip him of the powers and protections that had defined his position for nearly 14 years. Nero, according to the accounts that survive, was genuinely stunned by the speed and totality of his political collapse once it finally began accelerating in earnest. He had spent years cultivating an image of himself as a beloved artist and a divinely favored ruler, surrounded by advisors like Tigellinus, who had built their own positions on flattery and encouragement rather than honest counsel about the risks accumulating around him. The sudden, near-total abandonment by the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and increasingly the wider political and military establishment left him without any clear plan for how to respond to a crisis this fundamental to his continued survival. He reportedly considered several increasingly desperate options in these final days, including fleeing to Egypt, where Roman grain supplies originated and where he might theoretically have raised support or at least secured a comfortable refuge beyond immediate reach. Other advisors suggested he appeal directly to the legions still nominally loyal to him, or throw himself on the mercy of the Senate in hopes of negotiating some kind of reduced but survivable position. None of these options, discussed in increasingly frantic and disorganized fashion within the palace, ever moved beyond mere consideration into any actual coordinated action. The physical isolation surrounding Nero during these final days matched the political isolation that had already overtaken him. Servants and officials who had once surrounded him constantly began quietly disappearing from the palace, calculating correctly that continued association with a doomed emperor carried genuine personal risk as the political situation continued deteriorating. Even his personal guard, the soldiers specifically tasked with his immediate physical protection, began melting away as news of the Senate's declaration and the Praetorian Guard's formal defection spread through Rome. By early June of 68, Nero found himself in a position almost unimaginable given the absolute power he had wielded for nearly 14 years. A Roman emperor formally declared a public enemy by his own Senate, abandoned by the guards specifically created to protect him, and increasingly uncertain whether any faction within the vast empire he nominally still ruled retained genuine loyalty to his continued survival. The theatrical triumphs of Greece, the golden splendor of his enormous new palace, the elaborate performances that had once drawn carefully orchestrated crowds of adoring supporters, all of it had proven entirely insufficient against the harder, more fundamental political reality that Roman imperial power had always ultimately rested on military and senatorial support rather than artistic acclaim. Galba, meanwhile, continued his march toward Rome from Spain, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that the throne was likely already his without requiring any further military confrontation. The Senate's formal declaration against Nero, combined with the Praetorian Guard's defection, had effectively settled the question of imperial succession before Galba's forces ever needed to test their strength directly against whatever remained of Nero's own diminishing support. What remained now was simply the final, personal reckoning, the question of what would actually happen to the emperor himself once the political and military structures that had once protected him had finished collapsing entirely around him. Chapter 15: The Last Flight. In the early hours of June 9th, in the year 68, Nero woke inside the palace to find that the last remnants of his personal guard had abandoned their posts entirely during the night. He had gone to sleep still nominally an emperor, however precarious his position had become. He woke to something closer to genuine solitude, the great machinery of imperial protection that had surrounded him for 14 years simply gone, without warning or formal farewell. He reportedly moved through the palace, calling out for anyone who might still be present, receiving no response from rooms that had, until recently, been full of servants, officials, and guards attending to his every need. Suetonius describes him searching for a gladiator or any other companion willing to help him end his own life quickly, a request that found no one willing to answer it. The isolation was total, and it seems to have struck Nero with genuine disorienting force, a man accustomed to constant attention now facing his final hours essentially alone. A small group of loyal freedmen eventually gathered around him, including a man named Phaon, who owned a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome and offered it as a hiding place while Nero considered his rapidly narrowing options. Among this group was Epaphroditus, a secretary who had served Nero faithfully and who would play the decisive role in the events about to unfold. The emperor, disguised in a plain cloak to avoid recognition, made his way through the city's outskirts toward Phaon's villa, a journey that itself carried a kind of bitter irony given the elaborate, carefully staged triumphal processions that had marked his return from Greece barely a year earlier. News reached the small group hiding at the villa that the Senate had formally condemned Nero to death by the ancient traditional method reserved for the worst offenders, to be stripped naked, secured by the neck in a wooden fork, and beaten to death with rods. This was a punishment designed specifically to strip away every trace of dignity from its victim, a fate Nero found genuinely horrifying to contemplate. He began pacing and weeping according to the accounts that survive, repeating variations of a single phrase, that such a fine artist was about to perish, unable, it seems, to separate his own impending death from the artistic identity he had spent years cultivating. As soldiers sent to carry out the Senate's sentence drew closer to the villa's location, Nero finally accepted that suicide represented his only remaining path to avoiding the humiliating public execution the Senate had ordered. He asked Epaphroditus for assistance, apparently lacking the resolve to complete the act entirely on his own, despite having ordered the deaths of numerous others throughout his reign with considerably less hesitation. According to the traditional account, Nero pressed a dagger to his own throat, and Epaphroditus helped guide the blow home as the sound of approaching horsemen grew audible in the distance. He died before the soldiers actually arrived, though accounts differ on the precise final moments and whether he was still breathing when they reached the villa. One centurion, according to Suetonius, attempted to stop the bleeding and claimed he had come to help rather than harm the emperor, a gesture that arrived, in any case, too late to change the outcome regardless of its sincerity. Nero was 30 years old, having ruled Rome for nearly 14 years, and his death that morning marked the formal end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had governed the empire since Augustus first established the imperial system exactly 100 years earlier. His final recorded words, reportedly spoken as he realized death was approaching, were Qualis artifex perio, the world loses a great artist in me. Whether these were his exact words or a later embellishment designed to capture something essential about how Nero understood himself remains impossible to verify with certainty. What the phrase reveals, regardless of its precise historical accuracy, is how thoroughly Nero had come to view his own life and death through the lens of artistic identity rather than through the political and military responsibilities that Roman tradition expected of its emperors. His body was cremated with a modest ceremony arranged by a handful of loyal women who had cared for him during earlier periods of his life, including his former nurses and, according to some accounts, a freed woman he had loved before his marriages to Octavia and Poppaea, complicated his personal life so considerably. This quiet, private funeral stood in sharp contrast to the elaborate public ceremonies that had marked so much of his public reign, a final irony for a man who had spent enormous resources ensuring his artistic and athletic triumphs received maximum possible spectacle and attention. Public reaction to Nero's death, once word spread through Rome and the wider empire, revealed the same complicated divide between elite and popular sentiment that had characterized much of his later reign. Rome's senatorial aristocracy greeted the news with evident relief, having spent years growing increasingly alarmed by an emperor whose behavior seemed to depart further from traditional expectations with each passing year. Ordinary Romans, and particularly populations in the eastern provinces, where his generosity and cultural sympathies had earned genuine affection, responded with considerably more ambivalence, some genuinely mourning an emperor who had, whatever his flaws, provided spectacle and occasional generosity that mattered enormously to people living far from the political calculations dominating senatorial concerns. That popular affection proved durable enough to generate a peculiar historical phenomenon in the years immediately following his death, several impostors emerging across the eastern Mediterranean claiming to actually be Nero, insisting he had somehow survived and would soon return to reclaim his throne. These so-called false Neros attracted genuine, if temporary, followings in various provinces, a testament to how deeply some populations had invested in Nero's continued survival, despite the overwhelming evidence of his actual death. None of these imposter movements gained enough traction to seriously threaten the new political order taking shape in Rome, but their persistence across several years reveals something genuine about the complicated legacy Nero left behind him. Galba, who had positioned himself as the natural successor throughout the crisis of Nero's final months, entered Rome shortly after receiving confirmation of the emperor's death, formally assuming the throne that the Senate and Praetorian Guard had already effectively granted him weeks earlier. His reign, however, proved remarkably brief and unstable, lasting barely 7 months before his own murder at the hands of Praetorian soldiers who had grown disillusioned by his failure to pay the enormous donative Nymphidius had originally promised in his name. This assassination opened what Roman history would remember as the Year of the Four Emperors, a period of chaotic civil war during which Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian would each claim the throne in rapid, often violent succession. That extraordinary instability, unprecedented in scale since the earliest, most turbulent days of the imperial system itself, reveals something important about what Nero's death had actually destabilized beyond his own individual reign. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had provided, whatever its individual rulers' flaws and excesses, a continuous bloodline connection back to Augustus that had given the imperial system a kind of inherited legitimacy extending across 5 successive emperors. Nero's death without any direct heir shattered that continuous inheritance entirely, revealing starkly that the empire's stability had rested considerably more on this specific bloodline's accumulated legitimacy than Romans themselves had perhaps fully recognized while it remained intact. Vespasian's eventual victory in 69, emerging from the chaos as the founder of an entirely new imperial dynasty, finally restored a measure of stability that Rome had not experienced consistently since the earlier, more settled years of Nero's own reign. His rise marked a genuine transition point in Roman imperial history, a recognition that legitimate imperial authority no longer required direct bloodline connection to Augustus himself, but could instead rest on military support and administrative competence demonstrated through the brutal, clarifying test of civil war. This shift would shape the character of Roman imperial succession for generations to come, a lasting consequence of the collapse that Nero's final, chaotic months had ultimately set in motion. History's judgment of Nero himself would prove remarkably durable in its harshness, shaped considerably by the fact that the historians who eventually wrote the fullest surviving accounts of his reign, Tacitus and Suetonius chief among them, wrote during the reigns of later emperors who had every political incentive to portray their Julio-Claudian predecessor in the darkest possible light. This does not mean the darker elements of Nero's reign were invented or exaggerated beyond recognition, since the matricide, the executions, the persecution following the Great Fire, and the staggering self-indulgence of the Domus Aurea are all reasonably well attested across multiple independent sources. But the full complexity of a reign that began with genuine competent reform and ended in theatrical excess and political collapse rarely survives intact in popular memory, compressed instead into the simpler, more durable image of an emperor who fiddled while his city burned around him. That image, however historically imprecise in its specific details, captures something genuinely true about the deeper pattern of Nero's reign that contemporaries themselves recognized long before later historians formalized it into enduring legend. Here was a man handed absolute power over the known world at 17, guided initially by capable advisors toward genuinely responsible governance, who gradually discovered that unlimited authority freed him to pursue his own artistic and personal obsessions without meaningful restraint. The tragedy, if the word even applies to a man responsible for so much genuine cruelty toward others, lies precisely in that discovery. A Roman emperor who wanted, more than anything else, to be loved and celebrated as an artist, and who destroyed both his family and ultimately his own empire's foundational stability in pursuit of an adoration that, in the end, could not save him from dying essentially alone in a borrowed villa, mourned by a handful of loyal freedmen, rather than the applauding crowds he had spent his entire reign chasing. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a place once the shouting has stopped for good. Baia's shoreline still catches the evening light the way it did that night the boat went under, water folding over itself calmly, indifferently, the way water always does regardless of what happened on its surface centuries before. The villa where Nero spent his final hours no longer stands, its stones long since scattered or built into something else, something ordinary, a wall or a foundation for a house belonging to nobody in particular. Rome absorbs its own history that way, quietly, without ceremony, folding the extraordinary back into the everyday until only a name and a handful of stories remain. Somewhere beneath the modern city, fragments of the Domus Aurea still exist, buried under later emperors who filled its lake and built their own monuments over the ruins of Nero's golden vision. Excavators, centuries later, would crawl through its darkened corridors by torchlight, tracing painted walls that once glittered under mechanisms designed to shower guests with perfume and flower petals. The gold is gone now, stripped away long ago by successors eager to reclaim what they could and bury the rest. What remains is stone and plaster and the faint outline of ambition, cool and silent, waiting underground for anyone curious enough to climb down and look. Think of the Circus Maximus on an ordinary evening, long after the races and the crowds have gone home. Grass grows now where chariots once thundered around the turns, where a fire once found its first spark among stalls selling oil and timber. The valley holds its shape still, a long oval hollow between two hills, patient the way land is patient, unconcerned with what burned there or who watched it burn. Wind moves through the empty space at dusk the same way it moved that July night, indifferent to the difference between accident and rumor, between an emperor's guilt and an emperor's grief. There is something to be said for objects that outlast the people who made them matter. A bronze statue, recast and renamed so many times across the centuries that its original meaning dissolved entirely, still stands near where the Colosseum was eventually built, a structure that would come to define Rome far more permanently than anything Nero ever raised. A handful of coins, his profile worn smooth by handling, occasionally surface in museum drawers, cool and heavy, carrying a face that once commanded an empire and now commands nothing beyond a glass case and a small printed label. Consider, too, the quieter fact of ordinary Roman lives continuing on, regardless of who sat on the throne above them. Bakers still rose before dawn to fire their ovens. Fishermen still worked the Tiber's current for whatever the river offered that morning. Children still ran through streets that had, within living memory, burned to the ground and been rebuilt wider, sturdier, better able to withstand whatever came next. History remembers emperors, but cities are built and rebuilt by people whose names nobody thought to record, hands calloused from work that outlasted every palace and every purge. Somewhere along the coast near Antium, the sea still moves the way it always has, unhurried, patient, folding onto sand that has forgotten every ship that ever launched from it. A gull settles on a rock, wings folding closed, still against the wind. The water darkens slowly as the light goes, and there is nothing more to it than that, stone and salt and the tide moving in, indifferent to empires, indifferent to fire, indifferent to anything but the simple, endless pull of the moon overhead.